If you listen to Chinese authorities, they're the fastest rising power in the world, growing their military by leaps and bounds and expanding their influence around the world. If you listen to worried politicians in the United States, you'll probably hear the same thing. They all say it could be a Chinese century, but the actual truth might be very different. Is China, the world's largest country by population, actually on the verge of collapse? One of the reasons China should be worried about their ascendance to superpower status might be right there in the title, world's largest country. It's not going to hold that title for long, maybe not even for another year, because while China has been the most populous country for hundreds of years, that streak is about to come to an end. India will overtake it as the world's most populous country in the near future, and trends indicate that it won't be overtaken anytime soon. That in itself doesn't mean China's falling apart, but the facts behind it are worrying. China's population has been a subject of concern for leadership for a long time. During the early days of the Communist Party's rule, the growing population taxed limited resources extensively. So in 1980, the government instituted a one-child policy that lasted 35 years. Backed up by extensive propaganda campaigns, it was an efficient way to cut down population growth. This required massive government oversight, including arrests of couples who had illegal second children and in some cases confiscation of children. But the government of China was not receptive to protests and the policy stuck, forcing couples to make hard choices that included many people choosing to terminate pregnancies when they were having a girl because if they could only have one child, they wanted a strong, strapping young lad who could help them around the farm. And that pattern created a worrisome effect. Although the one-child policy was abolished eventually, and now China actively seeks to raise its birth rate, it caused a generation of damage to the country's demographics, with a much larger number of boys to girls born. It made it hard for young men to find wives, and the government first started to try to account for this in the 1980s, allowing rural parents to have a second child after having a girl. And the one-child limit was eventually replaced with a two-child limit, then a three-child limit, before being abolished completely in 2021. But decades of oppression caused lasting effects. Families in China have largely gotten used to having few children, and many are sticking to the numbers they're used to. As China's population ages and dies off, the country has seen record low population growth, barely making it above replacement level in the last few years. The trend is likely to continue barring something unexpected, which means China might become one of the few countries in the world to see an actively shrinking population. But population isn't everything these days. Many of the most powerful countries in the world aren't even in the top 10 population-wise. That's the good news. The bad news is everything else. If there's one word that could normally be used to describe China's government, it is stable. It's one of the longest-lasting communist governments in the world, with the Chinese Communist Party ruling consistently since the country's civil war in 1949. Its various leaders had different perspectives and left the country in various shapes, but they all answer to the larger party structure, which has never come close to being toppled. They set the law with very little room for input from the people, leading to many protests being put down by force, as was most famously seen in the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. And absolute power also means the dissidents have nowhere to hide. The CCP might not be exclusively communist anymore. They've opened up their country to business interest extensively, which greatly contributed toward their economical prosperity. But little has changed in the way they govern the nation. They crack down on any sign of dissent, and no one is safe. From random protesters to powerful business executives, they've even made their oppression high-tech with advanced surveillance techniques and a social credit system that penalizes people for signs of disloyalty to the government. The goal is to make the price of defiance too high for anyone to risk going against the government's wishes. But if people are pushed far enough, could the CCP remain in power? Many of China's issues have been brewing for a long time, but they largely exploded in 2020. China was ground zero for the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you ask 10 people, you probably get 15 answers about what they think really happened. But what is known is that as soon as the virus was detected in China, the government cracked down, isolating whole cities in large-scale lockdowns that kept people trapped in their homes or in government quarantine camps for extended periods of time. The containment strategy caused much controversy, but it was initially effective and helped China get its cases much lower than the rest of the world, at least so far as we know. And then COVID-19 went away and everything was fine. Right? If there's one thing we know, it's that COVID is persistent. Most countries came out of their initial lockdowns and the virus came roaring back. It was clear they couldn't lock down every time an increase in cases were detected, so instead many countries concentrated on the measures like mask mandates and vaccination drives. But in China, there was no public pushback against draconian lockdown laws, and China instead decided to continue harsh lockdown strategies every time a case was reported, a strategy which continued into 2022. Many cities like Shanghai have been the subject of this treatment, including most famously Shanghai Disneyland being closed down, with many of the people in the park being moved to a nearby quarantine camp on site. So much for the happiest place on earth. To say the public was angry would be putting it lightly. For the first time since 1989, the Chinese government was potentially facing a protest it couldn't simply put down. Mass numbers of protesters took to the streets in 2022, expressing outrage at how they'd been treated, with many complaining of being unable to get food or medical treatment due to the COVID protests. China cracked down, of course, but current leader Xi Jinping was hesitant to order a full crushing of the protests like his predecessor did in Tiananmen Square. Maybe he was worried about his global reputation, or maybe he just knew it wouldn't work. Because this wave of protesters were savvy, modern, and knew how to game the system. This well-organized group of protesters were using the internet, including social media sites like Twitter, to mobilize. China's cyber experts tried to sabotage this by flooding the related tags with spam and pornography. They also had an interesting choice of protest sign, with many carrying blank pieces of paper. This was ostensibly to express how they were being silenced, but it also made it impossible for the government to charge them with carrying seditious messages, because they weren't carrying any messages at all. And suddenly, Xi Jinping started looking a little nervous. The current leader of China had just been elected to a historic third term as the head of the CCP, the first to do so since Mao Zedong. And rather than try to crush the protesters and send a message to the world, he started backing down and liberalized some of the COVID-19 restrictions without actually admitting fault or promising it wouldn't happen again. This was the first indication that China under Xi might be vulnerable to public pressure and would be loosening some of its restrictive policies. But everyone knew this would be a dicey prospect. Any indication that the CCP was weakened might cause the government to reverse course and crack down to preserve its public image. And that's because China would prefer to look outward right now. While China has many conflicts domestically, they're growing by leaps and bounds internationally, or so it seems. While China has the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, it's considered to be much more advanced than Russia, which largely makes it the closest rival to the United States. While Chinese authorities are often belligerent toward the United States, including making over-the-top threats, like shooting down the Speaker of the House's plane if she visits Taiwan, most people believe this is for domestic consumption rather than an actual threat. A war with the United States would likely end in an unimaginable destruction, and most analysts believe the US would be the heavy favorite to win. But China is much more concerned with local affairs. China's activities in the South China Sea have been controversial in recent years, with the country building many manufactured islands and claiming large swaths of the sea as their territory. This has caused domestic conflict with Vietnam in particular, but few of the countries in the region have the military strength or allies to oppose China directly. But far away, China has a very different strategy. China's biggest new investment in recent years has been in Africa, a diverse continent that was heavily colonized by Europe over the centuries, and as such is very open to a new alternative. That alternative came in the form of China, which wanted to set up factories, mining operations, and other investments in multiple African countries. This arrangement provided the locals decently paid jobs, although most of the highest positions were often staffed by Chinese liaisons. Many analysts fear if war breaks out, China could use these business arrangements to cut off supplies from the United States by calling its chips in with African allies. But China's larger business investments might soon have been impacted by a looming problem. Remember during the 90s when it suddenly seemed like everything was made in China? It didn't matter if it was a plastic cup, a sweater, or a new piece of electronic. China seemed to be the place to get things made, to the annoyance of many a grandpa who wanted to know whatever happened to good old-fashioned American manufacturing. Well, that factory's likely long closed down, Granddad. Companies moved much of their manufacturing to China thanks to the lower cost of manufacturing and less red tape. But that often meant some corners were cut along the way. This manufacturing boom helped China's economy explode, and soon they became powerhouses in countless other areas, including movie making and app design. But it might all be about to come crashing down. The Chinese business boom only lasts as long as foreign companies are comfortable doing business with them, and to a large extent, that golden era is over for a number of reasons. A good test case is Disney, who invested heavily and prioritized the Chinese market. They even built that theme park there. But the honeymoon was over when China's censorship bureau started demanding changes to completed films to allow them to be released in China. That's why many recent Marvel movies haven't even been released in China, including the first MCU film starring an Asian hero, Shang-Chi. And other businesses have become increasingly hesitant too. Having an outpost in China used to be a great investment, but due to the government's recent crackdowns, it's become much dicier. There were several high-profile detentions of foreign business travelers and journalists that made it seem like too big of a risk to send people there. Additionally, more attention was paid to China's cyber hacking and data mining efforts, particularly the mega popular Chinese app TikTok. While all the kids are filming their dances and posting their hot takes, China might be mining their data, which even led multiple politicians to call for banning the app in the United States outright. And even that good old Made in China sign might have had its best days behind it. Manufacturing in China is still definitely the cheaper option, but the ethics are becoming more worrisome, especially given how many of China's factories are staffed by prisoners and who those prisoners are. The internment of the Uyghur Muslim minority and other religious minorities and dissidents has gained a lot of attention over the years, but never more so than it did in 2018, when an American woman opened a Halloween kit from Kmart, and in addition to a bunch of fake skulls and plastic headstones, she found a piece of paper. It contained a message from a prisoner in a labor camp detailing the brutal conditions they endured. More and more people are asking if that cheap knick-knack is worth the human cost. And all this creates a potentially grim picture for China going forward. If China loses much of its foreign investment, is its domestic situation steady enough to keep itself afloat, or will it collapse like a house of cards? The challenge for China is that many of its problems intersect, and if one area collapses, it could make it impossible for them to keep another area under control. Experts in Chinese society are all united in saying that the country could face a period of crisis and decline in the near future. For one thing, their COVID policy might make it near impossible to recover. Most Americans remember the long, dark days of 2020 when many people didn't know when or if their businesses would be allowed to open. That status quo is long gone here, but in China it never ended. A small COVID outbreak could trigger the lockdown of an entire city area, and that could cause countless businesses to close their doors permanently. The zero COVID policy also serves as a body blow to another area, tourism. After all, international travel has gotten trickier since COVID began, and getting in the country is enough of a challenge itself. In China, you have to hope your area doesn't become a hotspot, or getting out could become a challenge too. And another global crisis is also looming. Climate change poses the biggest challenge to coastal and island nations, where the rising sea levels could actually wipe some cities off the map within a century. But every country is experiencing it in some way, especially if they weren't prepared for extreme weather. The province of Sichuan was hit by a massive heat wave and drought in 2022, and the city became heavily dependent on air conditioning to keep functioning. Problem was, the temperate region wasn't equipped for this kind of hit on its power grid, and it caused heavy blackouts. Factories were forced to shut down, many people struggled in the burning heat, and Beijing was forced to respond with massive bailouts to keep the region afloat. Many are asking, is Beijing prepared for what's to come? China's seeing its economy draw down in many ways, including a devastating rollback in its property market. China was investing heavily in building new housing, with many houses being sold while still under construction. But as the economy contracted, construction slowed, and many people found themselves with houses or flats that couldn't be lived in or sold. So people started refusing to make mortgage payments while the houses were incomplete, and that created a real estate crisis that's ongoing. The government provided a major bailout to the real estate sector, but it didn't restore confidence. And many people are asking, is Beijing doing enough? Just about every area of China's economy is struggling right now, including real estate, the tech sector, and small businesses. So in August 2022, China announced an investment of 1 trillion yuan, which is around $200 billion that'll go directly into the economy. But while the infusion of cash was welcome, many people wondered if it was being used effectively, and it doesn't seem like any of the larger issues behind the economic crises are being addressed. And China is still lacking in infrastructure in many areas. Others say the onerous regulations of the Chinese Communist Party are stifling innovation, but no one is sure how fast China will respond. And that raises the question, how bad could things get? China's economic moves to boost its struggling economy have largely been modest, including a cut in interest rates, but it's impossible to separate their economic problems from the other challenges the country is facing. Back in 2008, when the world was hit by a massive economic crisis, China responded much more quickly, unleashing a huge stimulus package that pumped a lot of money into the global economy. That was brought on as much by self-interest as anything else. China's economy was booming at the time, and the leadership knew they had as much to lose as anyone else if the global economy hit a long-standing depression. But this time, the rest of the world is recovering much faster than China is, and China's other policies are contributing to its problems. China is the only country in its economic sphere to still be conducting COVID-19 lockdowns, which means places like South Korea, Japan, and rising powers like India and Vietnam are starting to look much more like inviting places to do business with. This is especially the case for India, where their fast-growing economy and population are making them a regional power, one that looks like a good place for investors. But while there have been some minor signs of liberalization on COVID lately, Xi Jinping has been very hesitant to abandon the initial 2020 strategy, which means that companies will be more hesitant to invest. But China's future might also be shaped by its allies. While China has a massive challenge going into 2023, it's nowhere near the crisis facing another former superpower, Russia. As 2022 opened, Vladimir Putin promoted himself to the title of Tsar of Greater Russia. Many pundits assumed he would run over Ukraine in weeks and then set his sights on NATO. The reality has been very different. Bolstered by NATO weapons, Ukraine has held off Russia and limited them to minor gains in the east. Its president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has become a global hero. Meanwhile, Russia's found itself diplomatically and economically isolated, running out of troops and weapons, and a global pariah under massive sanctions. It's almost out of allies. That is, besides one. Aside from fellow pariah states like Syria, Iran, and North Korea, the only major country backing Russia is China. Early in the war, Xi Jinping and Putin signed an agreement of mutual support, and China provided Russia with arms. But as Russia's fortunes changed, China started backing away slowly, not wanting to be associated with Russia's incompetent war. However, it's not clear which direction things are going. If Putin starts looking like he's about to lose the war, will China back him up with more supplies? If they do, would the decrease in investor confidence accelerate the collapse of China's economy? Of course, the big unanswered question about a Chinese economic collapse is how China would react. While China's economy contracts and its reputation around the world declines, its government has actually become more belligerent, conducting war games dangerously close to the island nation of Taiwan, which China has long claimed as part of its territory. The United States has vowed to defend Taiwan, but no one is sure if that promise will be worth the paper it's printed on, especially if China threatens to target the U.S. mainland. So in a situation where China is struggling and its people are outraged, an invasion of Taiwan might be seen by Xi as a way to create a rally round the flag effect that could boost his fortunes. Of course, that depends on one thing: winning. For the strategy to pay dividends for China, they'd have to do what Russia couldn't: win and win quickly. Taiwan has a powerful navy and a lot of willing suppliers. While it's likely the US and its allies would not want to get into a shooting war with the Chinese soldiers in the event of an invasion, they might be willing to supply it in the same way they did Ukraine. And that could create a situation where China's sending the best weapons up against a well-fortified island with powerful backers and expending money and manpower it does not have. And if the world's second-largest economy declines, it's likely to have a devastating effect across the board. China might not be exactly a superpower, but it's one of the most influential countries in the world thanks to its powerful military and deep economic investments. And if COVID lockdowns, inflation, and angry protests continue to destabilize the nation, it's likely that other countries will continue to distance themselves from China and the CCP, leading to a snowball effect. Where will it stop? Just like in the Great Depression, no one's exactly sure, but it'll probably knock over a lot of things along the way. In 2019, U.S. media accused China of bullying in the South China Sea due to its giant terraforming operations to create artificial islands. One of the major consequences of these islands being built up, according to the press, is the possibility of an all-out war with the USA. That's not how China explains things, nor does it admit things could presently be going wrong with these islands. As you'll see in the video today, China might have a major problem on its hands, which could turn into a supremely expensive, catastrophic failure. Before we get to those failures, we should explain exactly what these terraforming operations are and what they might mean for countries in the region and for all of the US. We'll finish the video with our thoughts on how useful those islands would be in a war with the US. Let's start off with Fiery Cross Reef, said to be China's biggest land reclamation project in the South China Sea. China claims the island, part of the Spratly Islands, for itself, but so does Taiwan, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Before 2014, there really wasn't much going on at Fiery Cross Reef, but now it looks like a place that would be useful in a war. As you can see on any map, the area is surrounded by many nations. China claims much of the region as its own, which includes the Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands, and also other places such as Pratas Island, the Verreker Banks, the Macclesfield Bank, and the Scarborough Shoal. China places a 9-dash line around the areas it thinks it controls. But where did China get the idea that everything within this 9-dash line was part of its territory? Who gets to make such decisions when so many countries are nearby? The most powerful country might be China's answer, but its rivals would certainly disagree. China was the world's superpower for centuries. If you look at the history of global GDPs, China and India were both much richer than the other powers in the year 1000. It's believed together their GDPs made up about 50% of the world's total GDP. In the year 1600, that share was 51.4% of global GDP, with China being about 29% and India around 22%. From around 1700 to the late 1800s, China was easily number one. Depending on which historian you ask, sometimes these values are slightly different, but no one disagrees that China and India led the world in terms of money. China called Europe a backwater for centuries, when much of Europe really was a backwater compared to the highly advanced civilization of China. This is one reason why China can confidently talk about its ancient maps and records that show various dynasties, including the Song, Yuan, and Ming dynasties, which were in control of the South China Sea. An official Chinese statement to the EU in 2016 said, according to Chinese ancient texts as far back as the Han dynasties, China had large-scale activities of ocean navigation, trade, and fishing, with the South China Sea being the major ground of China's maritime activity at the time. It goes on to say that China discovered these islands, the islets, the reefs, and the shoals, and other countries and the EU might disagree. Nonetheless, it explains China's claims. Before China's so-called 100 years of humiliation said to have begun in 1839, China's economy was 6 times bigger than that of the superpower Great Britain and 20 times bigger than the fledgling USA's. But all this changed, and it changed relatively quickly. During this period, much of China's territories were lost. Due to many factors including China's isolationism, as well as a failure to properly modernize its military and corruption within the Qing dynasty, China experienced a century of military losses. With them, it lost much of its territory. The British kicked this all off with the First Opium War between 1839 and 1842. That's when China lost Hong Kong. In the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, the French joined the Brits in beating up China. This was not a good time for China, as it signed what it now calls a series of unequal treaties. The French and the English even looted China's summer palace during this phase in China's history, which even the West now admits was very much out of order. This period was certainly a humiliation for the advanced nation of China, which some scholars say is a reason for its sometimes aggressive attitude. The words "never again" are now a part of China's political rhetoric. In the Sino-French War of 1884 to 1885, China ceded influence in North Vietnam to the French. Later, after the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, China lost control in Taiwan when Taiwan fell under Japanese colonial rule. The Qing dynasty of China had previously annexed Taiwan in 1683. As you know, Japan was defeated in World War II, and then after that, China reclaimed territories, including the areas we're talking about today. In 1949, the Chinese nationalists were defeated by Mao Zedong's communists. The nationalists escaped to Taiwan, but importantly, they still claimed the South China Sea. Prior to leaving it, it was this regime who drawn the territory map, an 11-dash line around the South China Sea. That's why Taiwan still claims to own this territory, but the PRC doesn't see it this way. The reason the line was reduced to 9 dashes was because of a treaty between Communist China and Vietnam. The history is a lot more complicated than this, but let's just say this entire area is heavily disputed by a handful of countries. Given its history, China doesn't think there's anything to dispute. Nonetheless, China and Taiwan claim the region for themselves, while other countries only claim parts of the region. For example, in 2009, China said China had indisputable sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea and the adjacent waters. Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Brunei disagreed. And Taiwan definitely disagreed. It's Vietnam and the Philippines who seem really against China's claims. Over the years, Vietnam has created 49 outposts across 27 different features in the Spratly Islands. The Philippines has built 9 outposts, but none of these nations have done the kind of building China has. As you'll see at the end, the Philippines has just taken a big step toward ensuring China doesn't try to take any more reefs or islets or islands in the region. Such disagreements might make more sense when you understand that about $3.37 trillion worth of global trade passes through the South China Sea every year. That's about a third of the total trade in the entire world. Almost 40% of China's trade passes through the South China Sea, as does about 80% of its energy imports. Close to 14% of all U.S. maritime trade passes through the area. If this trade corridor was ever blocked, it would cause mayhem in the U.S., as it would elsewhere. It's said around 30% of all global crude travels through the South China Sea. So do about half of the world's fishing vessels. Then you have the rights to fishing there and all the natural resources, including crude oil and natural gas. About $11 billion worth of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So, if a great big war were to break out, having control of this region would be a strategic feather in your cap. That's one reason why it really matters who the USA takes sides with in the disputes over these territories. Obviously, not China, despite China certainly having a strong claim. Still, other countries also have a strong claim. It should also be said that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea has invalidated China's 9-line claim. Also in 2016, an international tribunal said China had violated international law by building those artificial islands. Okay, so back to Fiery Cross Reef. We hope after hearing what we just told you, you understand why this 677-acre bit of land is so darned important. The Philippines, Vietnam, and Taiwan might claim the place, but it's China doing the construction there, and there's not much the other countries can do to stop it. The process of reclamation involves dredging sand, soil, and rocks with large dredging vessels from close to the reef. The materials are taken to the site, where they're laid down to create a surface. This space is compacted, and more heavy machinery reshapes and levels the place until the topography is just right. Once the land was raised at Fiery Cross, Chinese workers laid down the concrete and constructed the infrastructure and buildings. This includes an airstrip, aircraft hangars, communication facilities, radar installations, accommodation, port facilities, and various administrative buildings. The island is protected with coastal defense structures. In such a wild place, coastal erosion is more than possible. Creating bits of land in the sea and hoping it'll stay solid is quite ambitious, and maybe even a little foolhardy, not to mention expensive. No one knows exactly what China spent just on Fiery Cross, but it's estimated that it was around $12 billion. And that was years ago. As you'll see later, the upkeep might prove to be a very big expense. In 2014, China stationed about 200 soldiers on Fiery Cross. In 2016, after the 3,125-meter-long airstrip had been built, it started landing civilian and military aircraft there, including a military transport aircraft. It was subsequently reported that anti-aircraft weapons appeared on the island, as well as a missile defense system. There are also early warning radar sites on the island. This was reported after China had said it had no intention of militarizing the place. It didn't look that way to outsiders. The U.S. State Department soon issued a statement saying there was a pressing need for claimants to publicly commit to the reciprocal halt to further land reclamation, construction of new facilities, and militarization of disputed features. China's artificial islands soon became known as the Great Wall of Sand. While much of the rest of the world is talking about these islands being something close to stationary aircraft carriers or fortresses in the sea, China keeps playing down the fact that they're military installations, while they certainly look like military bases. China has a good reason to want to keep this area secure. It makes sense in a world dominated by power politics, especially in this era where people talk about the balance of power shifting from U.S. hegemony, unipolarity, to a global power balance, bipolarity or multipolarity. China might not want to get into a war with the U.S. and its many allies, but it certainly will want to defend one of the most important strategic areas in the entire world. Still, China won't admit that. It has just said it's improving the working and living conditions of people stationed on these islands, or that the islands are for fishing assistance, weather reports, offering shelter, or helping out distressed ships that pass by. Nonetheless, the Western media has pointed out many times that missile defense systems aren't generally required for protecting fishermen. Not all the islands look exactly like military bases, but many do, such as the Gavin Reefs, also claimed by Vietnam, Taiwan, and the Philippines. At just 210 acres, we're talking about a tiny place, about the size of 119 British soccer pitches, if we take those professional pitches as being 1.76 acres. It's now home to anti-aircraft guns and a missile defense system, so again, not exactly fisherman-friendly. The aptly named Mischief Reef at 1,380 acres is a much bigger project east of the Spratly Islands. Yet again, when China first started bringing in heavy machinery, some countries asked what China was doing there. It lies just 135 miles off the coast of the Philippines, Palawan Island. When the Philippines asked what China was doing, China said it was a fisherman's shelter. It now looks very much like a military base. The Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies released satellite images showing large anti-aircraft guns and probable close-in weapon systems. That said, China is arguably only doing what other nations would do in this world of balance of power politics. China's also built a 2,644-meter runway there. The country at least admitted this when it later said the weapons were placed there for freedom of navigation. The Philippines has said this is about one thing and one thing only: conflict or possible conflict. An international tribunal later ruled that it and other nearby reefs were low tide elevations that do not generate entitlement to a territorial sea, exclusive economic zone, or continental shelf, and are not features that are capable of appropriation by occupation or otherwise. In short, these reefs are not for building military bases, and since they're not classed as a nation's actual territory, the US doesn't have to legally make a so-called innocent passage past the islands because in terms of international law, there are no islands to speak of. China made something out of nothing. You can see China's progress through a series of satellite images taken over the years, which amounted to turning almost nothing into something. It's a similar story with Subi Reef. Once a piece of wild reef, now a developed bit of land with a military base, a harbor, and a landing strip about 3,000 meters long. Some of these islands are home to laser and jamming equipment. Fighter jets could land there. There's absolutely nothing about the island that screams fisherman's shelter. In the past, when the US Navy reconnaissance aircraft have flown through the area, they've been warned that they've strayed into China's airspace. One of those radio messages said China has sovereignty over the Spratly Islands, as well as surrounding maritime areas. Stay away immediately to avoid misjudgment. The pilot shot back, well, not literally, "I am a sovereign, immune United States naval aircraft conducting lawful military activities beyond the national airspace of any coastal state. Exercising these rights is guaranteed by international law, and I am operating with due regard to the rights and duties of all states." It's on these missions that US aircraft have seen that these islands are a bit more than places where fishermen can put their feet up for a few hours. Images show harbors that can take at least 40 military vessels. They expose runways big enough for bombers and enough weapons to turn disputes into something ugly. A US Navy spokesperson said they threaten all nations who operate in the vicinity and all the international sea and airspace. That's the reason for sojourns through the area, what the US calls freedom of operation missions. These operations, FONOPs, are what the US call operational challenges against excessive maritime claims, whereby the US demonstrates its resistance to excessive maritime claims. China is no fan of FONOPs, once calling a particular operation a serious infringement on China's sovereignty. It's not only the US that conducts them. In recent years, Japan, the UK, Australia, and France have all launched FONOPs, to which China usually invokes words such as escalation and provocation. But critics of this Chinese mission in the South China Sea have said the escalation started when China started building the islands. In all, there are 7 reclaimed pieces of land with a total area of 5.2 square miles. It might not sound like much when you put it that way, but you can get a lot of weapons and runways in that amount of space. Also, to put these great chunks of concrete in the sea, China's had to upset the local ecology. At Mischief Reef alone, which is about 6 miles long, China had to bury the original natural reef under millions of tons of sand and gravel. For all the islands, we're talking about many, many millions of tons of sand and coral that had to be dredged and dumped. When China started building these islands, people not overly concerned about military strategies and war warned that there was a good chance that these fake islands could wash back into the sea, which in short would make life for marine animals and plants very hard. You have oil and chemicals and all sorts of dirt that could form clouds of matter that the sea doesn't need. One professor argued that all we've really heard about is military threats and the environmental threat has largely been ignored. He told the media the worst thing anyone can do to a coral reef is to bury it under tons of sand and gravel. There are global security concerns associated with the damage. It's likely broad enough to reduce fish stocks in the world's most fish-dependent region. On top of this, Taiwan is saying China is stealing its sand, so Taiwan had to ramp up its Coast Guard efforts. Some say China's done this as a warning and also to ensure not as much money is spent on Taiwan's military. In 2020, the Taiwanese military cracked down on 4,000 Chinese sand dredgers and sand transporting vessels, which was a 560% increase from 2019. The country says these operations are wrecking not only local ecology, but also undersea internet cables. So, we have islands by the sea that by international law should not be there. They've been built on unstable ground, and as you know, this ground could erode and wash back into the sea. There might be no way of stopping this. China might be a technological powerhouse, but nature always has a way of saying, keep out. Reports have stated that on some of these islands, concrete is crumbling, which means the very foundations of these islands could wither away and what stands on them could collapse. This is reportedly happening not because of any freak weather, just because the islands are in such an unforgiving area. Matters could be made much worse if a typhoon hits. There's also tectonic activity that could easily shift their foundations, while natural erosion could also cause the subsidence of these islands. There's also a natural process called sediment consolidation. This means the material that was laid down can become more compact, and when that happens, the entire island could move downwards, aka sink. These islands are so low that global warming also presents a threat. If the sea level rises, it might swallow the islands. It's said the global average sea level has been rising at an average rate of about 0.07 to 0.14 inches per year over the last century, but global warming might accelerate this. It's not certain what'll happen, but low-lying islands are certainly within earshot of danger. In fact, it is possible that within decades, some of China's artificial islands could be totally swallowed up by the sea. That's if war hasn't finished them off long before that. The islands might well be sinking, and if they are, they could end up being huge wastes of money. Being so far away from the Chinese mainland, they aren't exactly easy to maintain in terms of structural problems. But even if they're not sinking, you have to ask what use they would be in a war. If it ever came to that, the US would likely strike at the 3 main islands with ballistic missiles, using electromagnetic warfare technology to get past the island's air defense systems. The US might also just form a blockade and starve the islands of food, weapons, or other materials. This would be quite a task given China's Navy now is big or bigger than the US Navy, although it doesn't have the same combat experience or missile strength. The main islands can hold a few fighter planes, likely 24 for each island, or even a bomber or 2, but in the large scheme of things, a stationary target is a lot easier to hit. That's why one military analyst asks, are they a military asset or a liability for Beijing? There's no doubt that if war did happen, the US Navy can neutralize these islands with cruise missiles. One analyst believes it would take 30 to 50 cruise missiles for every one of the biggest outposts. As the aerial photographs show, the critical infrastructure on these islands is lumped together. It would not be hard to hit something important, while penetrating munitions would cause damage to structures that seems are already eroding. The US Air Force could send in strategic bombers armed with cruise missiles sent from a number of bases. China might have enough aircraft shelters for its fighter aircraft, but with one runway, it would soon start to look congested down there, and any strike would quickly make that runway unusable. With US submarines, you also have supply issues for China. China does have enhanced anti-submarine warfare capabilities, meaning US submarines still pose a problem. This could be one reason why China has invested so much in submarines as of late. China's islands have rightly been called a challenge to enemies of the regime, but in the event of war, it's hard to see China being able to keep them. They certainly are a substantial presence in the region, but more so to smaller nations. The US could deal with them, we think. The US has seen its fair share of military failures over the years. The US would suffer greatly in the effort of trying to destroy them, there's no doubt about that. That is, if China can save them from sinking or falling apart before that happens, which we imagine will become a very costly venture for China. It seems the country is willing to spend the money, having reportedly just built the world's largest suction dredger that is 50% more powerful than the so-called super dredger used previously. The old one was 6,017 gross tons and had a dredging capacity of 4,500 meters cubed per hour. That was said to be the largest in Asia, so the new one is something special. What does this mean? Well, for one thing, it seems China is certainly getting ready to do some more dredging. That's why the government in Manila believes that China might move on to other islands in the region. It's the reason, or one of the reasons, why after 30 years, the Philippines is opening up its doors again to a U.S. military presence. U.S. troops will have access to 4 new military bases there. As China digs, the U.S. is setting up shop, just like it did during the Cold War. How this ends is anyone's guess. A lot of important lessons have been learned from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Unfortunately for China, all these lessons may have put a real damper on their future plans. It's no secret that China wants Taiwan. They continuously claim the island isn't a sovereign nation but part of the People's Republic of China. The United States and much of the rest of the world, including Taiwan, disagree with China's claims. When Putin invaded Ukraine, the Western world and the United States in particular kept a close eye on China to ensure that Xi Jinping didn't have similar ambitions as Vladimir Putin. Now that we're a year into this war, it's highly unlikely that Xi Jinping would do something as stupid as waging a war against Taiwan. Currently, there's only one brutal authoritarian leader who's dumb enough to invade a neighbor, and it's not going great for him. That being said, China has been keeping a close eye on the events unfolding in Ukraine and globally, and with each day that passes, Chinese leadership sees any future plans of seizing Taiwan slowly slipping away. So let's dive right in. Why has Putin's invasion become a disaster for China's future plans? Let's look at each lesson learned from the war thus far and how they all spell bad news for China. The tactic China is currently using against Taiwan is called gray zone operations. At a very basic level, gray zone operations are non-military conflicts and confrontations by one nation, normally a more powerful one, against another nation. This tactic is used to weaken a country's resolve and hinder its ability to grow and create allies. But the key is none of the the tactics cause military engagements or directly lead to war. China's been using this strategy in the Taiwan Strait for decades now, getting its name from the gray area between peace and a full-scale invasion. Along with gray zone operations, China's using another tactic against Taiwan called salami slicing. This is when a nation uses a series of many small actions to eventually achieve a much bigger outcome. The key here is that what the nation really wants to achieve is too difficult or illegal to do all at once, which is why it needs to be broken up into smaller steps. For example, China has slowly increased the number of times they've crossed into Taiwan's air defense identification zone until it's become the status quo. They next begin crossing the Taiwan Strait median line with aircraft and naval vessels. They've also been slowly deploying military forces on small islands and even creating artificial islands in the South China Sea. China continuously warns Western leaders against making close ties with Taiwan or visiting the island to restrict international diplomatic relations as well. And of course, China has used its economic might and influence in the region to put pressure on Taiwan's economy and politics. If these things all happened simultaneously, then the argument could be made that China was being too aggressive or preparing to seize control of Taiwan. However, these actions spread out over time allows the world to forget, while the culmination of gray zone tactics could eventually set the stage for China to officially incorporate the island nation into its territory. The crazy part is, this is all eerily similar to what Russia did just before invading Ukraine. Vladimir Putin used gray zone tactics in a variety of ways during his first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and then again just before the full-scale invasion in February 2022. In 2014, when Russia sent in little green men, who were later discovered to be a band of mercenaries known as the Wagner Group, Putin claimed he had no idea who they were. This plausible deniability was a gray zone tactic, albeit one that comes very close to being a military conflict. But the use of gray zone techniques, along with Russian posturing and the West wanting to keep the Russo-Ukrainian war from escalating any further, allowed Russia to annex Crimea. It's important to note that although Russia was using gray zone operations, war eventually erupted, which is something that China has undoubtedly made note of. However, before this happened, the West responded to the aggressive gray zone operations by Russia in a measured manner. This is exactly what China expects the response to be in their gray zone tactics in the Taiwan Strait. They can continually harass and weaken Taiwan, and it's very unlikely the United States or anyone else will send military aid, as they would not want to be seen as the aggressors. What China can expect is economic, political, and diplomatic pressure, which it has dealt with for decades and doesn't seem to be worried about. But now, here we are in the year 2023. Russia's in a brutal war with Ukraine, and China can only shake its head at the utter failure of its allies' invasion. When Russia switched from gray zone tactics to full-on invasion in 2022, China watched closely to see what NATO's response would be. This way, they could learn what to do and what not to do if they ever decided to invade Taiwan. We don't know, and probably will never know, if China had any plans to invade the island nation in the near future, but if they did, Putin's failing war is likely acting as a deterrent for China to switch from its current gray zone strategy to a more aggressive approach. Let's look at how the world reacted to Russia's invasion of its neighbor and the lessons learned. Putin's invasion has been highly informative for the Chinese leadership. Unfortunately for them, the way the world reacted to Russia's invasion was likely not what they were hoping for. Lesson 1. China learned that size doesn't always matter. China has the largest navy in the world in terms of pure numbers. However, as China and everyone else has learned from the war in Ukraine, having a lot of equipment and soldiers does not necessarily mean you will win a war. One thing is glaringly obvious when China looks at its battle plans to invade Taiwan. They'll need to launch some type of amphibious assault onto the island if they hope to take it by force. When Russia rolled tanks and infantry into Ukraine, it was relatively easy due to the fact that the countries are right next to each other, and Ukraine doesn't really have natural defense features. For China, the Strait of Taiwan poses a huge logistical problem. It's generally agreed that an amphibious assault is much more difficult than a land-based one. In order to reach Taiwan, China's forces need to cross around 100 miles of water. That is 100 miles that Taiwan can unleash aircraft, missiles, and bombs to annihilate huge numbers of Chinese soldiers and vessels. Taiwan would fire artillery shells and anti-ship missiles to decimate the invasion force. When China looks back at how Ukraine was able to repel a massive land-based invasion, this probably gives them pause. Also, Russia lost the Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, in the early months of the war to what many suspect was a Ukrainian anti-ship missile. So it's clear that these projectiles would pose a huge threat to China's incoming invasion fleet. There's also the fact that Taiwan is an island, and its main defenses are designed to destroy naval vessels, which means they're likely to have a large stockpile of anti-ship missiles at their disposal. So China has learned from Russia's failure that their superior numbers might not be enough to invade and hold Taiwan. If Ukrainian resistance collapsed due to the sheer magnitude of Russia's invasion force, it would have been one thing. But that's not what happened, which is bad news for a Chinese invasion if they thought the Taiwanese people would just give up because China has a much bigger military. Lesson 2. Russian soldiers showed China that training makes all the difference. When analyzing why Russian troops are faring so badly in Ukraine, China must realize that Ukrainian troops are much better trained than their Russian counterparts. This, along with better communication and tactics by those in command, has allowed Ukraine's far inferior numbers to decimate Russian forces. Upon closer inspection, China and the rest of the world find that many Ukrainian soldiers were trained through the United States National Guard State Partnership Program. Since 1993, the Ukrainian armed forces have been trained using the U.S. model of delivering mission-type orders and empowering Ukrainian soldiers to make in-the-moment decisions on the battlefield. The U.S. National Guard trainers use realistic combat exercises to help hone the skills and wartime decision-making of the Ukrainian military personnel. This has made an enormous difference in the war and allowed the Ukrainian military to be much more effective than the Russians. The bad news for China is that Taiwan joined this same program in 2022, which means every day that goes by, their military is receiving the best training in the world, which will only make an invasion of the island much more difficult in the future. Lesson 3. China has learned that just because nations are far away doesn't mean they'll stay out of the conflict. There's no doubt that China is the most powerful nation in East Asia. In fact, they're much more influential than Russia could ever hope to be in Eastern Europe. However, China knows from the war in Ukraine that Western nations half a planet away will still come to the aid of a country that they deem important. Ukraine is not a part of NATO, but NATO nations are sending billions of dollars in military equipment and aid. Case in point, the United States, which is on the other side of the Atlantic, has sent more military aid to Ukraine than any other country. What this means for China is that even though the U.S. is separated from Taiwan by the Pacific Ocean, it will almost certainly send military and humanitarian aid if China invades. Although the United States will likely do more than that, due to the fact that when President Joe Biden was asked if the United States would fight along Taiwan in a conflict, he gave a resounding yes. So by watching the United States send more aid than any other country to Ukraine, China saw their hopes for an ambivalent U.S. in a conflict with Taiwan become more of a dream than a realistic scenario. If the United States is willing to send billions of dollars, high-tech weapons, and state-of-the-art tanks to Ukraine to help them defeat Putin, there is little doubt they would offer the same type of assistance to Taiwan. The difference is that in a China-Taiwan conflict, the president has made it clear the U.S. would take a much more active role. Lesson 4. NATO has learned what works and what doesn't when a country like Russia or China threatens to invade. When Russia began mobilizing troops and sending its military toward Ukrainian borders, China watched what the response by the West would be. It's probable that, like the West, China knew what was coming next. The United States warned that the military exercises Russia was carrying out were just cover for an invasion, and Poland had been screaming at the rest of Europe to prepare for an imminent war for years. However, the response by the West during the weeks before the war broke out was what interested China the most. As more and more Russian troops were sent to the border, the West threatened to enact economic sanctions. China took note of this and likely was relieved at the response for their own future endeavors. Russia's plan, and a possible initial plan for China, was to invade, win the war quickly, and incorporate the vast resources and manpower of the invaded territory into their own economy. Yes, the sanctions would be painful at first, but once the war was over and Russia controlled Ukraine, a reduction in sanctions could be negotiated, and there would be an eventual boost to Russia's economy from the acquisition of Ukraine's territory. China would desire a similar outcome in Taiwan. Sure, there would be some repercussions from the initial invasion, but after swiftly taking Taiwan, they'd be able to negotiate the sanctions away. However, this is not what happened in Putin's war. Russian forces failed to capture Kyiv, and 1 year later, the war continues to rage, with Russia on the losing side. This is incredibly bad news for China for two reasons. The first is because they didn't get to see the scenario they'd hoped for play out, and therefore couldn't be sure how long the economic sanctions would last if they won a war with Taiwan. The second was that since the threat of sanctions didn't stop the invasion, and when the sanctions were enacted they didn't cause the economic turmoil the West had hoped for, it's possible that in any future conflict, the West's response to an invasion may be very different. Make no mistake, the economic sanctions put on Russia have slowly begun to cripple its economy, and they will have long-lasting and very painful repercussions for the nation. However, they did not work as quickly as the West thought they would. Now NATO is believed to be taking a new approach. Rather than deterring a foreign aggressor through sanctions, they're moving toward deterrence through denial. This is a disaster for China, as they would much rather have taken on the sanctions than the second option. NATO now realizes that the threat of sanctions is not an adequate deterrent to stop a powerful nation from invading its neighbor, especially if there is a ruthless dictator at the helm. Their new plan seems to be to deploy troops to a region before things go too far to act as an additional deterrent against invasion. Let's take Taiwan, for instance. If intel suggests that China is mobilizing an invasion force, the United States and its allies might have just threatened economic sanctions in the past. However, due to Russia invading Ukraine, even when the West made this threat, the new plan could be to send NATO forces on a training mission or create some type of joint task force made up of Taiwanese and U.S. soldiers. If China invaded and U.S. troops were caught in the crossfire, it could result in the West claiming China had attacked them, allowing NATO to enter the war on Taiwan's side. This tactic could act as a more powerful deterrent than just threatening sanctions, as the last thing China wants to fight is a war they cannot win against the West. In Europe, deterrence by denial is currently being implemented by sending entire battalions of NATO troops to the borders between allied nations and Russia. This buildup of troops forces Putin to think twice before trying to expand Russian borders any further. The same would be true if the West built up its military numbers around Taiwan. If troops from any NATO country are stationed on the island or near it, China will need to think very carefully about its decision to invade. It would be all too easy for NATO forces to get caught in the crossfire and bring the rest of the alliance into the conflict. The viability of this tactic becomes a little murky since Taiwan is not part of NATO itself, but due to Russia's actions, it's unlikely the West would solely threaten economic sanctions against China to deter them from invading the island. Instead, China needs to now live with the reality that the West is willing to go much further to stop an invasion than it did with Ukraine. Lesson 5. Sanctions are slow, but they do work, and China is very much aware of this. When Russia invaded Ukraine, economic sanctions were enacted. G7 nations froze around $350 billion in Russian assets almost immediately. This surprised even Putin, as he didn't believe the West was willing to escalate things so quickly. However, it's now clear that even if economic sanctions don't work as a deterrent, they will still be used as punishment if China ever decides to invade Taiwan. As Russia is currently finding and China is closely observing, the sanctions will cause turmoil down the road. Russia can no longer get many of the parts and resources it needs to continue resupplying its military. Their monetary reserves are quickly running dry, and their economy is suffering more and more with each day as the war continues. The sanctions took close to a year to show results, but it's happening. China knows firsthand how crippling sanctions can be as Russia pleads with them for aid. It might make Chinese leadership wonder if invading Taiwan will be worth the economic consequences for the country if the Russian economy completely collapses. The world is a global economy, and although China plays a huge role in it, it still needs goods and resources from other nations, including the West. On top of that, one of the largest aspects of the Chinese economy is its ability to manufacture goods for foreign countries and sell them in foreign markets. Two of the largest markets for China are the United States and the European Union. If they were to enact sanctions and freeze buying Chinese goods because of an invasion of Taiwan, the Chinese economy could crumble much quicker than Russia's. By watching what's happening to the Russian economy, China knows that sanctions would mean a sharp decline in foreign investments, decreased availability of key technologies, and a decline in exports. If the sanctions were short-lived, China might be able to weather the storm. But every indication coming out of Russia is that the West is willing to sustain harsh sanctions even at a great cost to their own economies. It's just another disastrous lesson that China has learned from Putin's war in Ukraine. Lesson 6. The invasion of Ukraine and the ensuing conflict has caused NATO to keep a closer eye on authoritarian governments, especially China's. It was not clear just how far Putin was willing to go before the invasion. He did a lot of posturing and made a lot of threats, but it was nothing new for the Russian dictator. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, it became clear that Putin would go all the way. This was initially a shock for many leaders around the world, but learning from their mistakes, NATO likely won't be taking authoritarian threats as lightly anymore. This has set up a less than optimal scenario for China. The gray zone tactics it's been getting away with for decades now might be taken more seriously by the West, all because Vladimir Putin took things too far. If Putin had never invaded Ukraine, China might have been able to continue using its gray zone operations to weasel its way into having more leverage over Taiwan. However, now the West will be watching every move they make, which is the opposite of what China wants if it's planning to eventually take Taiwan. The invasion of Ukraine was also a wake-up call to the United States and the rest of NATO. Ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO has enjoyed being strong enough that it was highly unlikely anyone would threaten their interests. However, this false sense of security is part of the reason why Russia was able to mobilize forces and invade Ukraine. For too long, the United States was ambiguous about how far they were willing to go to protect certain nations. The US had the most powerful military in the world. There's no denying that it's the backbone of NATO. But if the United States needed to fight alone, it could defeat any other country due to its sheer size and capabilities of its military. Both Russia and China are unable to keep up with the modernization of their militaries in the same way the US does. This means that the US has an edge in any conflict. After the invasion of Ukraine, the US realized that other nations might have forgotten how powerful its military actually is. US leaders had assumed that it no longer needed to explicitly state which nations it was willing to support and send aid to. However, Vladimir Putin made it clear that he was willing to invade a country even if it did have close ties to the US. This has opened the eyes of the US government, and they're now taking a much more active approach of drawing red lines and making explicit statements about which part of the world they are not just willing to support but will fight for. Unfortunately for China, the United States has made it clear that Taiwan is one of those places. If Putin hadn't invaded Ukraine, NATO might have continued to coast and allowed China to exert influence over Taiwan until its invasion plans came to fruition. Now there's very little chance the US will allow Chinese gray zone tactics to continue to the same extent as before. The US will most certainly be keeping a close eye on China from now on to ensure it doesn't mobilize any type of invasion force. And if it does, there will almost certainly be a military response by the US and its allies. Lesson 7. If an invasion goes wrong, power and influence go with it. If Russia had been able to quickly take Ukraine, dismantle its government, and incorporate its people into its territory, it would have been very bad news for the West. NATO and its allies would have needed to contend with the fact that Russia was a powerful adversary and that its military capabilities were as strong as Putin claimed it to be. But that's not what happened, and now the world knows that Russia is nowhere near as powerful as Putin made it out to be. An invasion is a great way to turn the world against you. A failed invasion is a great way to turn the world against you and to lose any respect and power you once had. Putin's war has shown Russia's weaknesses. Even neutral nations have turned their backs on Russia and no longer fear Putin the same way they had before the invasion of Ukraine. Russia has been called out for its war crimes, lost control of the narrative they were trying to create, and allowed NATO to become more unified and emboldened. All of these things resulted from the failed invasion of Ukraine. China now has to wonder if the risk of invading Taiwan is worth the reward. The Chinese government desperately wants to control Taiwan, and even though it claims the island is part of its territory, the fact that Taiwan has its own government and does not answer to the authoritarian leaders of China paints a very different picture. If China were to launch an invasion to incorporate Taiwan under its control and fail, it could cause China's power and influence in East Asia to become greatly diminished. China's worked hard to make sure it's the most dominant country in its part of the world, and to be fair, they have succeeded. Nations like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan all have close ties to the West, but no matter who you are in East Asia, you rely on China in some form or another. If China invaded Taiwan and a drawn-out war commenced, it might cause their influence to decrease in the region, while countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia become more influential. Seeing this very scenario unfold in Russia might give China pause when planning for the future and what they should do with Taiwan. Lesson 8. Just because a country is a major power does not mean the world can't live without them. When Russia threatened to cut off energy supplies to Europe, there was panic. Russia sold a massive amount of natural gas to Northern Europe and controlled a large oil supply as well. When Western nations decided to reduce their purchasing of Russian fossil fuels and put a cap on how much they would spend, the Russian economy suffered. They continued to sell resources to other nations, such as India and China, but at a reduced price, lowering their profits. Needless to say, just because Russia controlled a huge amount of energy resources that Europe relied on, didn't stop them from decreasing their dependence on Russia and finding other ways to fuel their homes, businesses, and infrastructure. This means that even though China controls a lot of resources in East Asia and provides goods globally, the world won't adjust or just do without them. China probably hoped to see the West cave in and give in to Russian demands, or at the very least, Europe would find they couldn't survive without Russian resources. But neither of those things happened. It would likely be a similar story with Chinese goods if they invaded Taiwan. Reducing reliance on China might be painful at first, and the global economy would certainly suffer, but it could be done. So why is Putin's invasion of Ukraine such a disaster for China? Because of the 8 lessons we've just discussed. The failed invasion of Ukraine is a warning to China that the world is a different place than just a year ago. Everything China has learned, NATO has learned as well. Any mobilization by Chinese military to invade Taiwan would likely be met with much more resistance than Russia faced. The United States will probably be more aggressive in its response, and even though China is a powerful nation, it does not mean that they will be able to stand against the combined might of the West. If things had gone differently in Ukraine and Russia had been successful in the early days of the war, China might have looked at the invasion of Taiwan more optimistically. However, Putin's disastrous war is a bad omen for any plans China once had of taking Taiwan by force. If you listen to the media, the world is currently in a pitched battle for control between rival superpowers, the United States and China. Is the United States on the decline? Is it truly going to be a Chinese century as China reaches the same level as the United States and potentially surpasses it? The tale of the tape is very different, and surprisingly, China may not be a superpower at all. In some ways, China and the United States do match up pretty competitively. China has a much larger population than the US, almost 4 times as many people. They control a similar amount of land, allowing both to dominate their continent. Both have significant holdings abroad in financial investments, but the US has a global military while China has only one major foreign military outpost in Djibouti. In terms of military strength, China is the only country that is seen as a near peer to the United States. They both have modern intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. While America has a much larger nuclear arsenal than China, China still retains the ability to strike the US homeland, and unlike Russia's massive Cold War-era arsenal, these missiles are modern and known to be working. But the definition of a superpower is a specific thing, and China is not there yet. The term superpower was first created in 1944 during the Second World War, and it referred to a state that was dominant and powerful enough to exert influence and project power across the world. When it was first coined, it referred to 3 countries with massive empires or puppet states around the world: the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. Not only are these states powerful enough to have an impact around the world, but no international action can really be taken without consulting these superpowers first. This made them largely invincible. They only had one weakness: time. This trio of superpowers wouldn't stay that way for long. The United Kingdom saw its mighty empire, which spanned the world at its peak, collapse in the decades after World War II. While the UK is still a powerful nuclear-armed nation, it doesn't have nearly as much power on the world stage as it used to. For a while, the US and the USSR were about as close to global equals as you could get until the USSR saw its communist government fall, and many of the countries it had conquered split off from its sphere of influence. Its current leader, Vladimir Putin, has no problem acting like Russia is still a superpower, but he learned a harsh lesson when his invasion of Ukraine ground to a halt while the rest of the world threw their money and support toward Ukraine. Russia's also found itself under sanctions and cut off from much of the global economy, showing that today's Russia is nowhere near as influential as the USSR. Then that leaves the United States standing alone, the world's superpower, right? Many have talked about the decline of the US on the world stage, with recent events not helping to inspire confidence that the state will remain the #1 spot. But is that actually impacting its global prestige and influence? Not really. After all, it's still a key member of NATO, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and by far the largest economy in the world. Its military spending is the highest in the world, and its military is state-of-the-art and only getting stronger. If anything, the fear over the US's seemingly instability might be because people see it as an indispensable global cop. Who knows what would happen if its leadership fell into the wrong hands, or if the country became involved in another bloody civil war. And it's not clear if there would be anyone to pick up the slack. China's rise has gained a lot of attention recently, as the Asian nation established itself as a dominant regional power and started making moves outside of Asia. It continues to claim Taiwan as part of its territory, but hasn't made direct moves against the island nation. Its artificial islands in the South China Sea have caused conflict with neighbors like Vietnam, and most of the time China wins these standoffs due to no one else in the region having the military might to challenge its navy. And further away, China's powerful economic sector means it has extensive leverage over other countries, potentially cutting them off from essential supplies if they cross it. And their heavy investments in Africa means that the continent could become a staunch ally in the future. All this put together makes China look like a superpower on the rise, but looks can be deceiving. During the early part of the 21st century, China's rise was the talk of the world, and they certainly acted like they were expanding fast. But since then, a lot of factors have converged to stop the country's rise in its tracks. The first and potentially biggest is a growing population time bomb. While China is still currently the largest country in the world by population, it's expected to lose that title as early as 2023 to India, largely due to China's very low birth rate. This is partially due to China's extended one-child policy, which lasted for decades and led to many couples having only one boy. That left China with a massive gender gap, and many young Chinese men were left without wives, nicknamed bare branches by the media. While the policy has since been rescinded, old habits die hard, and it's rare to see a Chinese family having many kids. As the population ages, that could cause long-term problems. It's not the only ticking time bomb for China's future. China's rise has largely been caused by its economic expansion, something that's become possible when the Chinese Communist Party ended its strict allegiance to Marxism and shifted to a state-run capitalist economy. The country's managed to pick up a lot of the world's manufacturing, particularly of technology, and that's given it a lot of sway. But people are becoming increasingly hesitant to invest in China due to how their products are made, often by prisoners with little to no safety protections. As the internet made it easier for news to spread around the world in an instant, it became harder and harder for China to keep its secrets, and that means China could see its ace in the hole become a pair of twos. Many companies have moved their manufacturing efforts to other countries, with India, South Korea, Vietnam, and Taiwan all becoming major hubs in recent decades. This is particularly the case for Taiwan, which now controls the majority of the world's semiconductor production, and those little devices are the key to making just about every modern computerized device run. This may be a big part of the reason China is interested in conquering Taiwan, but unless it pulls it off in a hurry, odds are the rest of the world will rush to defend Taiwan. Which leads to the other big question: could China actually win such a war? China makes a big show of its military strength, frequently conducting war games off Taiwan and placing its ships in neutral waters. But it primarily projects military strength right now in one way: intimidation. Its ships are modern and powerful, but China's huge military hasn't been fully tested in combat in decades. As one of only a few nuclear powers in Asia, and the one with the largest arsenal, it is the biggest bully in the local playground. But is it the biggest bully in town? The answer is probably not, as the US largely outclasses it in military strength. China might be able to win most local conflicts, but if the US gets drawn into the fray, China's choices would likely be back off or threaten the use of nukes. And that paints a pretty clear picture of who the current superpower is. Of course, China's biggest challenges to its potential superpower status might come from within, not from its rivals. China has frequently been mentioned as a potential second superpower, but as the country modernizes, it might actually be less likely to be a superpower. That's because China's population is increasingly educated and politically active, and they realize that they live in a country where they haven't had any real say in how the government is run for over 70 years. In the past, protests against the CCP have been put down rather brutally, but the country hasn't seen anything like the massive protests against the COVID-19 lockdowns in its history. These organized protests have become too much even for the usually tough CCP, and that disease might be China's downfall. When COVID-19 first appeared on the scene and turned the world upside down, China acted fast, locking down its cities where the virus appeared and keeping them locked down until cases died down. But while in many countries a lockdown just meant restaurants were closed and there were lines outside of every grocery store, in China they locked down and meant it. It was illegal to leave your home in many places, with lockdowns extending for weeks and even months. The initial lockdowns were deemed a success, and when the virus returned, so did the lockdowns. Even 2.5 years into the pandemic, major cities were being locked down under the same stringent rules as 2020, and the people had enough. Currently, the Chinese Communist Party faces the stiffest challenge to its rule it's ever seen, with mass numbers of young protesters showing up, waving blank papers to represent the way the country is silencing them, and to ensure they can't be prosecuted for seditious slogans. The lockdowns have also caused a massive decrease in tourism and investment in China, as outsiders are hesitant to visit when they don't know when it could become impossible to leave for several months due to an outbreak. After all, staying in Shanghai Disneyland sounds like fun until you can't leave, and you're shuffled onto the on-site quarantine camp. Be careful what you wish for, kids. All this has made several past predictions look rather silly. For much of the 21st century, experts were arguing that China's rise was unstoppable and that the country might even surpass the US to become the world's largest economy and most powerful military. Even in the United States, military analysts observed China's dominance over the Indo-Pacific has led them to become a superpower. China certainly views itself as one in the way it projects its power in the region, but its only influence outside of its own sphere is only created through economic deals, and if those slow down, China will find itself confined to being a regional power in an area with a lot of fast-rising rivals. Is the high ride really over for China? As far back as 10 years ago, some analysts were saying they believed China would never become a superpower. They pointed to a lot of factors, including China's aging population and increasing dissatisfaction with their government, and they identified one other major problem. China's fast industrialization has left it one of the most polluted countries in the world, with several major cities having hazardous air quality. That could impact the quality of life for its residents as they get older, and combined with a low birth rate, could mean China would see a massive decrease in its working-age population within a few decades. Another factor is China's dependence on the global economy. While China has a strong economy based on manufacturing, It needs customers to keep that going, and countries are increasingly hesitant to do business in China. This is due to COVID policies, ethics issues, and the history of China arresting foreign businessmen and journalists. If the bottom falls out of China's trade deals, the country could find itself dealing with a shortage of energy and raw materials, which could cause greater instability in the country and more protests that could eventually put an end to the Chinese Communist Party's rule. And it all might come back to one big question: do people want to move to China? Despite people yelling, "They took our jobs," immigrants are essential to a country's welfare. This is partially due to needing a workforce if the domestic supply of workers isn't enough to replace those leaving the workforce, but it's also the equivalent of a high-powered sports draft. If a genius immigrates to your country and sets up a new business there, it could be a multi-billion-dollar boon. Chinese-American professor Amy Chua argued that China will have a problem attracting immigrants in the future due to other countries having greater incentives. The country's authoritarian tactics and uncertain future might be other roadblocks. And the worst part is, few of these factors are likely to change. For China to become a superpower, it would need to keep building on its successes, but the opposite is actually likely to happen. All of China's major problems are like a ball rolling downhill. The population bomb they're facing is a demographic issue that'll take a long time to reverse, if it's even possible to do it. While China's actively trying to boost birth rates now, they're not seeing much success. The same goes for China's problem with attracting talent from outside its borders. Barring a complete overhaul in the government's approach to public affairs, it's likely that immigrants and corporations will be hesitant to invest in the country. The only thing that could change this is a massive overhaul in China's system of government. And if that happens, the future would still look uncertain. Say China's massive student protests continue and eventually bear fruit. Much like in Russia during the 1980s, they got a new leader who takes real movements toward reform. Democracy is introduced and people get a say. And eventually the CCP ends its grip over the country and allows something new to take its place. This is a massive change and one that will likely turn China's focus inward for the better part of a decade. The CCP's expansionist efforts will go on the back burner, and a China in flux will be less likely to seek military conflict. Foreign investors will likely be waiting to see which way the wind will blow before making heavy investments. The result might be a stronger, more free China that's able to better compete on the global stage. But it'll take a while to get there, and that'll mean China gets further and further away from being a global superpower while the US continues to consolidate its role. So, is the US likely to remain the sole superpower indefinitely? At first glance, it seems likely. After all, China is the closest competitor, and it looks like it's getting further and further away. Russia is increasingly isolated and looking like a cornered animal. The fastest growing country in the world, India, might be a contender, but with its focus still internal, and it has a serious border conflict with its nuclear neighbor Pakistan. While it's likely to evolve into a great power over the coming decades, it's not clear if it even wants to become a superpower. India has so far shown little ambition for expansionism, and in many rural areas it still shows characteristics of a developing nation, like a low literacy rate. But the most likely candidate to be a rival superpower might not be a country at all, exactly. With a population of 446 million, it's only behind China and India. With an area of 1.6 million square miles, it's only behind Russia in area. It's the European Union, the massive political union of 27 member states that covers most of Western Europe and is still growing. While it recently lost Britain as a member state, it has many other countries looking to potentially join. It has a nuclear power amongst its members in France, and all its states have a high Human Development Index indicating high life expectancy and education levels. If Russia's expansion into Ukraine and beyond is foiled, the EU could become the biggest winner, looking like an inviting option for any country worried about being targeted by Russia. Would it eventually be a rival to the United States? The biggest stumbling block might be a lack of a unified foreign policy and a modest military presence. But if its power continues to grow, the member states might eventually move toward greater integration to become a more cohesive unit. And given that most nations in the EU have close relations with the United States, it's possible the two superpowers could become a dominant global alliance. A small Vietnamese fishing boat putters along in the dark. A storm has knocked down its radio antenna, and the cheap GPS unit the poor fishermen use to navigate has long ago stopped functioning. They're sailing using the stars now, the way their ancient forefathers did, and cast a westerly course in hopes of hitting the mainland. Suddenly, a bright spotlight blasts the fishermen in the face, completely blinding them. A massive Chinese destroyer quickly steams in close to the small fishing vessel. In the dark, the fishermen hadn't even noticed it approaching. Two Zodiac craft full of Chinese Marines are tearing through the water at high speeds toward the fishermen, the machine guns at the bow of each boat aimed at them. With frenzied shouts, the Chinese Marines board the craft and push the fishermen to the floor, zip-tying their hands behind their back. They'll be arrested, interrogated, temporarily held, and eventually released back to their native Vietnam. Their ship will be pulled apart piece by piece in search of secret spy gear. The fishermen will never see it in one piece again. Their crime? Accidentally sailing too close to one of China's growing number of illegal military fortifications in the South China Sea. The controversy began back in 2014 as China began to implement a plan to aggressively expand its military power and national sovereignty into the South China Sea. With the world's largest fleet of dredging craft, China began to build up 7 isolated reefs in the South China Sea, hundreds of miles from mainland China. The massive ships sucked in sand from the bottom of the ocean and stored it in huge tanks, then released it onto the small beaches of these tiny reefs, gradually building up the reefs until it had turned into islands. The move was immediately met by international condemnation. Vietnam, the Philippines, and other neighbors have their own far more legitimate claims to the region, which China has largely ignored. Citing a map drawn by the Chinese national government in the 1940s and dubious claims about sea exploration during the Ming Dynasty, China maintains that a 9-dash line extending all the way to Malaysia in the south, the Philippines in the east, and running along Vietnam's coast is China's true national claim to the ocean. This 9-dash line encompasses nearly the entire South China Sea and ignores the economic exclusion zones of neighboring nations as set by international law. Along with its army of dredgers, China also developed a massive Coast Guard fleet dedicated to the intimidation and harassment of other nations' ships. Armed with water cannons, Chinese ships ran off Vietnamese, Malaysian, and Filipino fishing vessels while escorting its own fishing fleets to some of the world's richest fishing grounds. In an extremely bold and controversial move, China even moved an oil drilling platform directly into Vietnamese waters and began extracting petroleum and natural gas from the site. China's strategy was twofold. First, it would build up artificial reefs throughout the Paracel and Spratly Islands, turning them into solid ground and moving Chinese military troops there. Under international law, a country can't claim waters around an island feature unless that island has a permanent presence of the nation's inhabitants. This is also the reason why, to counter Chinese claims, the Filipino Navy regularly maintains soldiers stationed on old shipwrecks around reefs in the Spratly Islands. These soldiers rely on resupply from Filipino Navy ships for everything from batteries to food and water. Yet almost immediately, the Chinese Navy began to blockade Filipino Navy ships from reaching those soldiers in an attempt to starve them out of their positions. China's second part to its strategy, to illegally claim the South China Sea, was to build up a large enough military presence that it simply wouldn't be possible to remove China from the area. This would be tricky, though, as it requires massive construction efforts over many years until the islands were big enough to hold large amounts of military equipment. Vietnam and its neighbors in the South China Sea are too weak militarily to do anything about China's expansion, so they filed a complaint with the UN. In 2016, a ruling from the International Court at The Hague found China's claims and island reclamation abilities to be illegal and ordered a halt to further expansion on the contested reefs. China immediately ignored that order, and the world did nothing to enforce it. The real question is, why is China burning global goodwill for the sake of a few island bases? The answer to that is threefold, and the first part of the answer is economic. The South China Sea holds 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 11 billion barrels of oil in reserves, with much more believed to lie undiscovered. The surplus of energy is worth trillions to the Chinese, and along with its oil and natural gas, the region is also home to some of the world's remaining fertile fishing grounds, worth billions in revenue. By edging out all other nations from their own legitimate claims to the region, China has positioned itself to amass a staggering wealth, paying out over decades to come. Secondly, China has long chafed at the United States' status as a regional security partner with its neighbors. One of China's greatest ambitions is to throw the US out of the South Pacific, and thus bully its neighbors into its own political sphere of influence, no different than the Soviet Union and its Iron Curtain post-World War II. Today, the South China Sea is the world's greatest trade artery, with hundreds of billions of dollars worth of trade moving through the region every year. The US Navy guarantees freedom of navigation for all vessels in the region. Yet, if China could successfully push the US out of the region, all of that trade from nations around the world would be subject to China's authority. Any nations China finds itself displeased with could soon find their merchant vessels harassed or even outright barred from traversing the region, a serious concern for any country that doesn't want to be subject to the Chinese Communist Party's will. The plan is working. As China continues to build military infrastructure across the reclaimed islands, it'll become increasingly unrealistic for the United States Navy to remain in the region and expect to survive in case of war. With U.S. forces effectively pushed out of the region, China's neighbors will have no choice but to deal with China. Something Vietnam is so afraid of, it recently held discussions with U.S. diplomats about potential cooperation with the U.S. military. The third answer to China's wish to establish itself in the South China Sea is to protect itself from the military power of the U.S. China understands that it cannot challenge the U.S. Navy in a stand-up fight, even with a portion of the U.S. naval forces stationed in the Atlantic. However, the buildup of military facilities around the South China Sea has officially put China in a position to not just challenge the U.S. Navy, but to prevent it from operating in the region outright in the case of war. China has built just under 100 bunkers for fighter aircraft across its 7 artificial islands and invested billions in anti-ship and anti-aircraft missile batteries, long-range radar, signals intelligence equipment, and even missile defense batteries. Sea-Whiz gun mounts protect Chinese radar and missile installations, and several of the runways China built are large enough to host Chinese bombers loaded with long-range anti-ship missiles. All of this firepower has effectively made it impossible for the U.S. to intervene in the region at the outset of war and push back U.S. forces to Guam if they hope to avoid immediate destruction. While eventually U.S. firepower could level all 7 of these island bases, the investment would be extremely costly in terms of missiles and hardware both. Each base would need approximately 100 missiles to completely neutralize, and a significant number of those missiles would be knocked out by Chinese missile defenses. High-altitude airstrikes would be a far better option, but even B-2 stealth bombers would find the environment challenging to operate in, and non-stealth aircraft would have practically zero survivability. What's more, all the firepower needed to neutralize these island bases and open up the South China Sea again is much more desperately needed further up north in defense of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. All of these which no doubt find themselves under threat from Chinese forces should a regional war break out. The only American hardware that could operate within the contested sea space would be American submarines. Chinese anti-submarine capabilities are still lacking. However, these subs would be focused on sinking Chinese ships and subs and wouldn't be risked to just undertake largely ineffective missile attacks against the island fortresses. China's successful strategy to claim the South China Sea has been an incremental war of inches, with President Xi Jinping correctly guessing that the United States would never risk a full-blown war as long as China's aggressive expansion was done very incrementally, just a few inches at a time. Now, in 2021, not only has China won the war of inches, but guaranteed that in a future US-Sino conflict, freeing the South China Sea once more will require incredible amounts of American blood and resources both, a price we may simply not be willing to pay. In the end, it's the rest of the world that ends up losing as China wins big. The last war that China won was the Xinhai Revolution, and the only reason it was victorious was because China was fighting against itself. It's this war that led to the founding of the People's Republic of China that exists today. However, if we go back in time, the Chinese military rarely fared well in armed conflicts against foreign powers, and a lot of mistakes have been made by Chinese soldiers, generals, and leaders. We're going to take a look at some of the worst Chinese military mistakes in history. However, its biggest shortcoming might not be what you think. We're going to take you on a journey through China's past military blunders in the order in which they happened. In some of these wars, China fared worse than others, but the common thread is that the Chinese military lost each one, and there were devastating consequences for the Chinese people as a result. The failure to conquer territory in some situations and protect the homeland in others has led to China losing battles and wars that could have been won with a little more strategic planning. The First Opium War. The Opium Wars were a result of Chinese leadership trying desperately to stop the opium trade within its borders. Unfortunately for China, opium was extremely popular in Europe and was the largest export to Asia for countries like Britain and France at the time. By 1820, much of the population in China was either using or involved with opium in some way. The widespread addiction and connection to the drug led to the Chinese government cracking down on the opium trade, and in the spring of 1839, 20,000 chests of the drug were destroyed or confiscated by the government at a British warehouse in Guangzhou. Around 1,400 tons of opium were destroyed, unsurprisingly angering the Brits who were hoping to sell it for a hefty profit. Around this time, the First Opium War began, and China made some serious military mistakes that would cost them the war and lead to the deaths of thousands of Chinese soldiers and civilians. The following year, in 1840, British forces defeated China's Qing military in a series of campaigns. This was because Qing forces were not properly equipped or prepared to go up against the British. Throwing Chinese troops at an enemy force would be a common thread in military mistakes made by the Chinese over the coming decades. Knowing that the British had the most formidable navy in the world, China's leaders should have focused on protecting major waterways and ports. However, Beijing seemed to let the British command major channels and rivers without putting up much of a fight. Unfortunately for China, it didn't have the ships or the technology to stand up against the British Navy, and its ground soldiers were useless in naval battles. As the war progressed, the British Navy destroyed the Chinese blockade along the estuary where the Pearl River, now known as the Zhujiang, empties into the South China Sea near Hong Kong. The British fleet traveled up the river to Guangzhou, where they attacked and eventually occupied the city in May 1841. The British continued to win victory after victory as the Qing military struggled to keep the invading force at bay. The Chinese soldiers were dedicated and gave their lives to protect their homeland, but they were not as well trained or as well equipped as the British. The Qing leadership knew this, but continued to throw its soldiers at the British in hopes that they would somehow push the enemy out of their borders. This was a mistake that would cost the Chinese government and its people in the end. A hasty counterattack was launched by the Chinese troops in the spring of 1842, but the British held their ground and used the opportunity to take the culturally and economically significant city of Nanjing. This led the Chinese leadership to seek peace, resulting in the Treaty of Nanjing. China was forced to pay Britain for the losses it sustained while also surrendering Hong Kong to British control. The number of ports that Britain could trade with increased from 1 to 5, and since the British won, opium would once again flow between China and Europe. The First Opium War was a huge military failure for China, eventually leading to Britain wanting more influence in the region. To understand just how badly the First Opium War went for China, we can look at some key statistics. Around 20,000 British troops and allies were sent to China to fight. The Qing military consisted of approximately 200,000 troops, half of which were mobilized for the war. In hindsight, the Qing leadership should have probably utilized more of their forces to push the British out of their territory. It's estimated that the British forces sustained around 800 casualties, of which only about 70 died in battle. China, on the other hand, lost 3,100 men and 4,000 others were injured. These numbers clearly show that the Chinese military was out of their depth and some significant changes needed to be made to the tactics they used. The Second Opium War. Unfortunately for China, their military wouldn't fare much better in the Second Opium War. Before this war even kicked off, due to a series of unfortunate events, the Qing government had to contend with a rebellion. In 1851, a man by the name of Hong Juquan declared himself the brother of Jesus Christ and started his own brand of religion known as Taiping Christianity. Juquan started a revolution in southern China by uniting ethnic minority groups who felt overtaxed and oppressed by the Qing rulers. The Taiping Rebellion began in January in the southern province of Guangxi. An army of 10,000 men led by Fang Yunshuan and Wei Changhui attacked Qing forces in Jintian, in present-day Guiping, Guangxi. The rebel army surprised the Qing forces, known as the Green Standard Army, and pushed them out of the region. When Qing units tried to launch a counterattack, it was successfully repelled by the Taiping Army. With every battle its troops won, the Heavenly Kingdom's message spread and more people joined the Taiping Rebellion. The British saw the distracted Qing military as being even weaker than before and used the rebellion to further expand its influence in the region. Britain once again renewed hostilities against the Chinese, and the Qing leadership found itself fighting two wars simultaneously. Their first mistake in this conflict was treating ethnic minorities as lower-class citizens and subjugating populations throughout southern China. However, if the Qing leadership had not conceded so much to the British after the First Opium War, giving them a taste of future riches that could be pulled from the Chinese territory, perhaps the British wouldn't have almost immediately jumped at the chance to attack when the Qing military was focused elsewhere. Regardless, the Second Opium War would be another military blunder by the ruling Qing dynasty. In October of 1856, the British once again sailed up the Pearl River and sieged Canton. When the British couldn't break the stalemate between its forces and the Chinese, they collaborated with the French to bolster their numbers. Once France joined the fight, it was only a matter of time before Canton fell, which happened in 1857. The Europeans deposed the leadership and installed officials who were more sympathetic to their cause. Eventually, the British and French forces reached Tianjin, and the Qing were once again forced to enter negotiations that would not go in their favor. New ports were opened to European traders and residences in Beijing were given to foreign envoys. However, the biggest win for the Europeans and a huge blow to the Chinese leadership is that by the end of the Second Opium War, the drug would become formally legalized. This gave European traders easier access to the product that was making them so much money. Although it's almost always a mistake to fight two wars simultaneously, the Qing had very little choice in the matter. The Taiping Rebellion would have torn the country apart, and the encroachment by European powers would not be stopped due to the lucrative opium trade. The Second Opium War resulted in around 2,500 casualties for the Chinese and approximately 700 casualties on the European side. However, the Taiping Rebellion cost the lives of between 20 and 30 million people. Some scholars even suggest that as many as 100 million civilians and soldiers may have died during the Civil War due to famine, disease, and fighting. The Sino-French War. Just over 2 decades after the carnage of the Second Opium War and Taiping Rebellion, the Chinese military once again found themselves at war with a familiar foe. Now, as we were saying, just over 2 decades after the carnage of the Second Opium War and the Taiping Rebellion, the Chinese military once again found themselves at war with a familiar foe. The Sino-French War broke out when France began encroaching on the Vietnam territory that China had previously laid claim to. For years, the Vietnamese people had suffered under Chinese oppression and empty promises of modernization. This led to a nationalization movement across the country. So when France promised European infrastructure as well as access to more resources through trade and mild colonization, it seemed like a better deal for the Vietnamese leadership. By 1880, French troops had reached the borders of Chinese-held Vietnam, known as Cochin China. France had been able to defeat Chinese forces in the past alongside the British in the Second Opium War, and it was clear that the Chinese military had continuously made the same mistake of overextending itself. So French leadership concluded that the Chinese military was only a small barrier to overcome in order to secure Vietnam. This led to the French pushing further north and moving troops into Hanoi and Haiphong. China tried to be strategic in its response, but like in the past, things didn't always go their way, and thousands of Chinese soldiers would die. The Sino-French War was another military defeat in just over half a century. Between 25,000 and 35,000 Chinese troops were sent to Vietnam to protect the territory, but did very little to push France out of the region. In 1882, the great Chinese statesman Li Hongzhang tried to negotiate an agreement to turn Vietnam into a joint protectorate of France and China. However, when French leadership received the proposal, they immediately rejected it and responded by deploying more troops to the area. The Chinese government became overrun by war parties advocating for China to take a more aggressive stance in Vietnam, a decision that would end in tragedy. As more and more reinforcements were sent to the south, France leveraged their superior weapons and technology to fend off wave after wave of Chinese soldiers. Li Hongzhang created a new contract called the Li Fournier Agreement that would allow France to trade throughout the Tonkin region. China would also withdraw its troops from Vietnam in exchange for not having to pay indemnities. However, many in the Chinese government still wanted war, and for China to remain the dominant power in the region. This constant push to go to war was a huge error. General Zhang Zhidong took command of Chinese forces in Vietnam and enjoyed initial success in his campaigns to the south. However, when the new Chinese fleet of 11 steamers reached the coast of Vietnam, the French quickly destroyed them. In 1885, the Chinese military suffered several major defeats, solidifying the fact that the war parties in Beijing had made a terrible mistake. At the Battle of Ho Mok, the French 1st Brigade of the Tonkin Expeditionary Corps defeated Black Flag and Yunnan Army's forces. This prevented Chinese soldiers from reaching the French outpost at Thuyen Quang, which could have been a turning point in the war. When the siege was finally called off and the Chinese forces retreated to the west, around 76 French soldiers had been killed, with Chinese casualties much higher. The Sino-French War ended when a peace treaty was signed in Paris in 1885. China agreed to recognize the Li Fournier Agreement and provided France with trade opportunities throughout much of Vietnam. China was also forced to remove its armies from the region. The First Sino-Japanese War. The 1800s was a rough century for the Chinese military. Seemed as if the country was constantly at war with either colonial powers or other powers in Asia. In 1894, conflict erupted between Japan and China. Japan had been looking to modernize and simulate the success of European colonization. They had their sights set on mainland Asia and believed China was not nearly as powerful as they claimed, which turned out to be true. Civil unrest, poor leadership, and constant war had taken a toll on China. This spelt bad news for Korea, one of China's most important tributary territories, as it contained a vast amount of coal and iron that was vital to modernizing the region. Japan knew Korea could also serve as a staging ground for future invasions from the mainland to their islands. If Japan was to continue to grow its power and influence, it needed to expand its borders, and Korea's location and natural resources made it the perfect territory to colonize. In 1875, Japan began influencing politics in Korea to allow for more lucrative trade opportunities. Tokyo then began to support radical forces within the Korean government that wanted to push the country toward modernization. while the Chinese backed the conservative officials who were more closely aligned with their own desires. Things started to go from bad to worse when pro-Japanese reformers tried to overthrow the Korean government in 1884. This led to China sending in troops led by General Yuan Shikai to rescue the Korean king, but resulted in the deaths of several Japanese legation guards. War was narrowly avoided and things in Korea remained relatively stable for a decade. Then in 1894, while Japan's modernization program was in full swing, China assassinated a pro-Japanese revolutionary vying for power in the Korean government. This enraged the Japanese leadership. When the Tonghak Rebellion broke out in Korea and China sent troops to squash the rebellion, Japan responded by sending 8,000 of their own soldiers. Japan also managed to sink the British steamer Koshing carrying China's reinforcements. This attack only heightened the tensions between the two nations. On August 1, 1894, war between Japan and China officially was declared. Many believe that since China had a much larger military, it would be able to secure an easy victory. However, like the mistakes in the past, China relied too heavily on numbers and not enough on sound tactics. China did not take into consideration how rapidly Japan had modernized. Having better equipment, ships, and weapons, Japan began to win overwhelming naval and land victories, shocking the Chinese leadership and the rest of the world. The Japanese quickly defeated Chinese forces at the Battle of Pungdo, Battle of Songwan, and the Battle of Pyongyang, where approximately 2,000 Chinese soldiers were killed, while Japan only lost around 150 men. At the Battle of the Yalu River, 12 Japanese ships defeated 14 Chinese vessels. China suffered another 1,350 casualties, while Japan's losses were closer to 380 troops. Chinese forces didn't fare much better as the fighting continued into the next year. At the Battle of Weihai Wei, Qing forces lost 4,000 men, had one battleship captured, and another scuttled. China also had 6 torpedo boats destroyed and another 7 captured in this single battle. The Battle of Yingqiu led to the end of major combat during the First Sino-Japanese War. 55,800 Japanese troops and over 100 artillery guns were used to attack the bulk of Chinese forces, which numbered between 40,000 and 60,000. Additionally, 5,700 Chinese soldiers were killed, with another 6,000 being taken captive by the Japanese. During the battle, the Japanese lost less than 1,000 men. It was a total and utter defeat for the Chinese military. They had greatly underestimated their enemy, which was evidently a big mistake. The same tactic of relying on superior numbers rather than sound military strategy and modernization once again cost China the war. With so much success in Korea, Japan decided to take the fight to China. By March of 1895, Japan had invaded Shandong province and Manchuria. The Japanese Navy and ground forces were quickly approaching Beijing. China sued for peace, and the Treaty of Shimonoseki was ratified, which ended the war. China was forced to pay indemnity and give Japan trading rights within Chinese territory. The tragic part for China was that it had yet to win a major conflict during the 19th century, which led Western powers to seek even more concessions from the nation, as there was nothing they could do about it. The Chinese military was weak even if it had superior numbers. The century-long defeat of Chinese forces led to reform within the country as revolutionary activity against the Qing dynasty began. The Second Sino-Japanese War. While the Western world recovered from the horrors of the First World War, another conflict began to brew between Japan and China. Japan continued to modernize and spread its influence in Asia throughout the early 20th century. China was rightfully concerned by this and looked to resist Japanese expansionist policies. For most of the early 1900s, Japan maintained control of Manchuria. A significant part of the Manchurian population was recognized as being Chinese, even though most were actually of Manchu descent. And in order to gain sovereignty over its own territory, China began to take a more aggressive stance against the Japanese colonial practices. Between 1931 and 1932, Japan had enough of China standing in the way of its expansionist dreams. Japanese forces seized the city of Mukden and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. By the spring of 1934, it became clear that Japan was no longer satisfied with only controlling territory north of the Great Wall and declared all of China a Japanese preserve. Tokyo stated that China could no longer take action or make decisions without the consent of Japan. By 1937, China could no longer accept Japanese aggression on the mainland. A minor conflict along the Marco Polo Bridge close to Beijing started on July 7, 1937, as the result of a, quote, misunderstanding. However, this small battle quickly escalated into the Second Sino-Japanese War, when it became clear that China would not just bow to Japanese demands. The nationalists and the communists in China found a common enemy in the Japanese and put their differences aside for the time being to fight as a united front. This bolstered Chinese military numbers, but like in past conflicts, China would find that large numbers don't win wars. Due to political unrest and the oppressive nature of Japanese policies in the region, Beijing had not invested nearly enough time or resources into modernizing its military, making it ill-equipped to fight a war. When the conflict started, Japanese forces rapidly dispatched Chinese opposition. It only took 2 years for Japan to capture most of China's ports and major railways. By 1937, Chinese forces had been pushed out of Shanghai, and in December, Nanjing, the nationalist capital, fell to Japan. The occupation of the city and the decimation of its population by the Japanese would become known as the Nanjing Massacre. Around 300,000 Chinese civilians were slaughtered by Japanese troops. After the fall of Nanjing, Japanese forces dominated China. They took Canton, Shanxi, and Inner Mongolia. Chinese defense was ineffective in almost every battle. Its military had no control over the sea or air, as Chinese technology was so far behind the modernized Japanese forces. China's losses were staggering, but the nation's size and large population allowed it to endure much longer than the Japanese had anticipated. Every time Japanese forces would close in on a location of the Chinese leadership, they would pack everything up and move further west. This eventually led to a stalemate. China's tactics theoretically kept them from losing the Second Sino-Japanese War, but at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives and millions of people wounded. By the time World War II broke out, nationalist China had run into serious economic and social problems as Japan occupied much of the country, and there was unrest among the Chinese people. Once again, rather than focusing on its citizens, the Chinese leadership poured everything into the war effort even though it had very little chance of succeeding. This led to a massive number of refugees fleeing west, runaway inflation, and a general bad time for the civilians within China's borders. Malnutrition ravaged the population, and the Chinese people lost faith in their government. There was no good option for China when Japan became aggressive, but the mistakes and missteps that the nationalist government made led to large amounts of pain and suffering for the Chinese population. When more and more support for communism arose in China, the government instituted oppressive measures to try to suppress the movement. This was another mistake that had ramifications for both the war and the country as a whole. The Communist Party gained more control as the result of nationalist crackdowns, and its armies grew. Like in the Second Opium War, the Chinese military was about to be faced with a war against its own people and a foreign invader. Clashes between the nationalist forces and communist forces began throughout the region, all while Japanese occupied much of the country. The inability of China to remain unified even during one of its bloodiest wars in history shows how poor leadership may have been one of its biggest weaknesses. The main reason China was eventually able to reclaim the territory occupied by Japan was because of the intervention of the United States. As the war in the Pacific erupted in 1941, the U.S. began sending supplies to China from India. The U.S. trained Chinese soldiers and engineers. However, Chinese forces had been diminished to the point that they played a relatively small role in pushing Japan out of mainland Asia. Modern day. On October 1, 1949, the People's Republic of China was formed. Since then, China has not participated in a major war. We'll circle back to this fact as being one of the military mistakes of the current Chinese leadership. That being said, China was involved in some very minor conflicts. Early in the morning of October 23, 1962, the sun rose over the hilltops of the Himalayas. Indian soldiers heard the far-off sound of artillery fire echoing off the cliff faces. Shells exploded along the line of actual control between Chinese-controlled Tibet and India. A contingent of Chinese soldiers approached the border and began to fire at the Indian border guards. This was a poorly planned attack, but it appeared at the time that China was ready to start a full-blown war with India. The Indian soldiers were overrun, 17 men died, and 13 more were captured by the Chinese invasion force. The remaining Indian soldiers fell back to the nearby Buddhist monastery at Tawang, which the Chinese attacked the following day. Small skirmishes broke out across the region. Indian soldiers tried to mount a resistance, but the mountains made this area incredibly hard to reach. The Chinese soldiers continued to march south toward Assam, one of the region's wealthiest and most important settlements. Just under a month after Chinese forces crossed the line of actual control, they retreated back to their side of the border. On November 21, 1962, the Chinese declared a ceasefire, and the war to control the Himalayas came to a swift end. At the time, it seemed China would be successful in occupying Arunachal Pradesh. They had taken numerous mountain villages and towns, so the Indian military couldn't believe their luck when the Chinese military just gave up for no apparent reason. 1,383 Indian soldiers were killed in the brief war, and around 1,700 went missing in the treacherous landscape of the Himalayan mountains. Chinese records indicate their forces had killed 4,900 Indian soldiers and citizens and captured another 3,968. However, the actual numbers are likely somewhere between the two nations' reports. To this day, no one except for the Chinese government knows why their troops were recalled. Maybe they had other plans, or perhaps the Chinese military thought they had overextended themselves and couldn't resupply its own troops. Yet, even though the Chinese could have taken the Arunachal Pradesh region of India in 1962, they didn't, which seems odd as there would be continued fighting along the border for decades to come. China also briefly invaded Vietnam in 1979 for 29 days. However, no territory was seized or any major changes made to the borders or geopolitics in the region as a result of the Chinese military action. We've now come to the worst military mistake in recent Chinese history. It's not that Chinese leadership has made exceedingly bad decisions or thrown its soldiers into the meat grinder like in the 19th century. Instead, it has to do with the fact that China has not been in a major conflict since World War II. We're not condoning warmongering or saying that countries should constantly be at war, but there's no denying that militaries such as the United States have a lot more experience in warfare than China does. China rarely takes part in UN peacekeeping missions, and since it has remained relatively isolated in terms of military alliances, its joint operations and training have been limited as well. China's worst military mistake of the modern era is that its troops are likely not prepared to fight a war. A lack of wartime knowledge greatly hinders the effectiveness of the Chinese military. Could their unwillingness to engage in past conflicts or work more closely with nations with experience in fighting wars, such as is done with the NATO alliance, be China's biggest military mistake when it comes to future wars? Only time will tell. It's not out of the realm of possibility that if China does end up going to war over Taiwan or any other border dispute, it may fall back on its old tactic of throwing as many troops at the enemy as possible without strategic planning or consideration for their opponent's capabilities. As history has shown, this tactic has not worked out great. Yet, China's made this very same mistake repeatedly. How could one of the largest economies in the entire world suddenly need the support of its biggest competition? What led to China experiencing staggering growth and seeking to engage with the US? And could ironing out their rocky relationship even be of benefit to either country and their economies? Well, we're about to find out. Welcome to the Infographics Show, and join us as we do our best to determine the real reason that China might desperately need the United States again. From late 2019 all the way through 2020, and with many of its effects still being felt today, the entire world was rocked by the COVID-19 pandemic. Many schools and businesses needed to implement social distancing measures in order to reduce the spread of the respiratory virus, and in some countries, nationwide lockdowns became a regular occurrence. The pandemic had a considerable economic impact on every major country across the globe. The fallout of so many businesses closing their doors in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19, as well as restrictions on importing and exporting goods, meant that for many countries less money was going into their economies while plenty was going out. This led to significant financial fallout the world over, which some economies are only just starting to recover from. But over in China, that recovery seems to have been unexpectedly hindered. For a time, China's economy looked to be doing relatively well, getting better post-COVID at a rate that was actually exceeding the Chinese government's expectations. Although the country's consumers were avoiding larger purchases like new cars or apartments, and a number of Chinese factories were running at lower capacity than usual, their exports were recovering and in some cases actually getting stronger. Since exports are one of the major, if not the most important pillars holding up China's economy, free-flowing global trade is crucial for the economic well-being of the nation. Some of their biggest international buyers are the United States, Hong Kong, Japan, and Germany. Over the past decade, China's exports have steadily grown, with the exception of 2009. During that year, the global financial crisis and an economic downturn across the world caused trade to slow down in most countries. Additionally, 2016 was another year that saw notable decreases in global demand for products exported from China. As well as being the most heavily populated country on the planet, China is also both the largest manufacturing economy and the largest exporter in the world. This means that anything that hurts global trade inevitably has some kind of negative impact on China. Earlier in 2023, a few months before we made this video, China was getting back on its feet, at least economically speaking. The construction of new housing was on the rise, and although that had slowed down slightly, there was still plenty of investments being made into the infrastructure and manufacturing sectors. This wave of economic activity started in December of 2022, when the Chinese government lifted their zero-COVID measures, which had enforced a number of industry shutdowns and mass testing for the coronavirus. While intended to monitor and potentially slow the spread of COVID-19, these precautions had the side effect of also slowing down something else: the growth of China's economy. During the fourth quarter of 2022, the country saw a worrying uptick in cases of COVID-19, which caused growth to drop just short of 3%. After the zero-COVID measures were lifted, this growth went up by 4.5% between January and March of 2023 when compared to the figures from the same months during the previous year. This growth was largely driven by consumers gaining purchasing confidence, spending money, and thus fueling the economy. So why is all of this important? China plays a crucial role on the global economic stage. It's the second largest economy in the entire world, with only the United States ranked above it. China's gross domestic product, the value of all the goods produced and all the services provided during a single year, was almost $18 trillion. Considering this is around 17 to 20% of the global GDP, if China experiences an economic downturn, that shock will almost certainly impact every other nation in the world. China is also part of the economic group BRICS, which also includes Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa. BRICS is a complicated topic in and of itself, but for the purposes of this video, you just need to know that in 2022, China outranked all other BRICS member countries in terms of GDP. However, despite this, 2022 was still considered to be one of the country's worst economic performances in years. Given the size of its economy and the rate at which it has grown, China has been one of, if not the single driving forces behind economic growth for the entire world. And that's what makes it so important, and why a sudden, unexpected slowdown in their recovery from COVID's economic aftermath should be a cause for concern for other countries, especially those that trade with China. That being said, we're living in a time where there are constant tensions between various nations across the world, and as those continue simmering, they can occasionally boil over and cause disagreements to occur. Despite perhaps not always seeing eye to eye on everything, nations like the United States and many throughout Europe maintain an interdependent relationship between their economies and China's. Although there was a warning that a painful economic slowdown was on the horizon, the country's GDP during 2022 indicated that the second largest economy in the world was coming back with a vengeance and shaking off the struggles of the pandemic. China had already taken a number of steps intended to stimulate some rapid growth in its economy. One of the most important investments China has made so far has been in its infrastructure, laying the groundworks for high-speed rail lines to connect the colossal nation, as well as building new highways and bridges. You might think at first that investing all that money in infrastructure wouldn't lead to massive economic growth, and that's partly true, but providing easy access to travel routes can allow workers to arrive at their jobs faster, thus making them more efficient. The more efficient, the more profit a company makes, in theory, and the more that money can contribute to the overall economy. It also serves to make the country's logistics smoother in general, allowing the transport of goods to move at a faster pace. And that's not even mentioning the jobs that can be created by investing in infrastructure. After all, a highway or a high-speed train won't build itself. You need engineers, planners, and construction workers in order to achieve those goals. All of these factors contribute to growing the economy. Additionally, China's primary bank, the People's Bank of China, announced to commercial banks that they were permitted to hold slightly smaller reserves against possible losses, which freed these banks up to lend more to people seeking loans. The effects of these economic policies were also felt on a smaller scale. When it came to traveling or frequenting restaurants, public spending was on the rise. Some hotels were forced to shut down their elevators to save money amidst the losses they'd made during the pandemic. Now, these same establishments, which only saw occasional diners in their restaurants, were now receiving hundreds of customers, with lines of people waiting for a table trailing out the door. However, these hints that the economy was stabilizing were perhaps misleading. There was an increase in consumer spending, but it was uneven. One butcher at a street market in Suzhou noticed that his customers were still being frugal, staying highly selective about where and how they spent their money. Frugality is of course a person's right and down to their own discretion, but this particular vendor, a small business owner, noticed the impact it was having on his sales. However, a catfish vendor within the same Suzhou market had a different experience. As he often sold his wares to local restaurants, his business significantly slowed down during the pandemic when local restaurants shut down. Then, once restrictions were lifted, the same clients he'd sold to previously were placing large orders once again. Those two different examples taken from businesses within the same marketplace are basically a microcosm for what's been going on with China's economy when it comes to how consumers are spending their money. Money is still changing hands and flowing through the economy, but it's not happening everywhere. China's economy is getting stronger, but unevenly. Some sectors contributing to the Chinese economy haven't even started to fully recover yet. Another industry that was hit hard by having to shut its doors during the pandemic was movie theaters. Despite the increasing yet uneven level of consumer spending in areas like food, a whole third of China's movie theaters are yet to reopen. Countrywide box office revenue was down by a staggering 55% in March of 2023. Needless to say, things still aren't running smoothly. It isn't all bad though. Much of the rest of the world is finding the economic fallout of COVID is coming in the form of inflation, in large part thanks to governments injecting money into their economies during the pandemic in a nearsighted attempt to stop them from crashing. But over in China, there's actually very little signs of inflation. One of the more commonplace strategies during the pandemic in Western countries was to send relief checks or coupons to households of essential workers in order to bolster their income while they still had to work during the rise in COVID cases. In China, this wasn't the case, meaning there was a limit to how much companies could raise the prices of their goods as there was less money to go around. Of course, part of the reason for the continued frugality and uneven spending among the population is largely down to how the pandemic affected people's incomes. Millions of working people in China had their incomes severely depressed, and the amount they currently make still hasn't caught up to pre-pandemic levels. In February of 2023, unemployment of people between the ages of 16 and 24 was just over 18%. Within a month, it had already climbed more than another 1.5%. Fortunately, this isn't the case for other demographics, with unemployment between those aged 25 to 59 dropping down to 4.3% in March of 2023, down from 4.8% in February. In addition, factories are also attempting to work their way through the backlog created by having to shut their doors during the pandemic. The output of factories, mines, and power plants all contribute to China's overall industrial sector, and production was able to significantly rise in early 2023 as these businesses attempted to meet the demand for their goods. However, the demand for these goods didn't just disappear during the height of COVID. A lot of the country's industrial production centers around the products it exports internationally. The industrial sector is in a delicate balance of attempting to quickly recover from the effects of the pandemic, while also having to try to catch up on a backlog of orders for parts and goods that it built up while the zero-COVID lockdowns were in place. One of the largest sectors experiencing a sharp slowdown because of this is China's automotive industry. Car sales dropped over 13% in the first quarter of 2023, also being hindered by the government reinstating an added sales tax on the sales of gas-powered cars, likely implemented to encourage people to turn to electric alternatives. Now, all these factors have led the pace of China's economy to slow right back down. In spring of 2023, the annual pace of economic growth dropped to a little over 3%, which, as you can imagine, the Chinese government wasn't all that pleased about. It falls short of their target for restabilizing their economy. This all begs the question, just what does the United States have to do with all this? Well, the current falter in their economy has encouraged senior Chinese officials to engage in talks with other nations, even those often considered to be their geopolitical rivals. The United States and China are the two largest economies in the world, and together account for around 40% of all global economic output. Naturally, they've been rivals for quite some time, and yet they are also largely dependent upon each other for trade that brings money into both of their economies. Despite not always being on the best terms, with both attempting to sever their dependence on one another, the two have continued to engage with each other on an international economic level. Now, though, China has seemingly changed its tone toward the United States. The climate envoy for President Joe Biden, John Kerry, and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen were both invited to Beijing on separate occasions for diplomatic meetings with high-ranking Chinese officials. Similarly, ministers from China are expected to travel to Washington, D.C. in order to conduct further talks on issues like climate change and trade. Seeking to announce to the world that China is open for business, and in order to stoke up its economy, the country's premier and second highest official met with some of the country's biggest tech companies to encourage them to hire more workers, with an emphasis on stirring up more economic growth. There's been an ongoing push by the Chinese government to try and assert greater political control over its tech industry, prompting many Chinese professionals in the field to emigrate. Whereas China's foreign policy has historically held more animosity, This softening in their approach, especially toward the United States, brings with it security concerns. While the more lax policy and friendlier diplomatic relations between the two could lead to the positive change China is seeking for its economy, their previous relationship could be what makes the U.S. reluctant to accept the proverbial olive branch. Recently, China enacted policies that would undermine its role within the global supply chain, affecting other companies that rely on them for trade. They declared intentions to limit the export of certain rare materials used in the production of semiconductors. This was widely believed to have been done in retaliation against the United States after they limited the sale of their exports of said advanced semiconductors to China. As much as it's possible that China's recent economic struggles might soften their approach to foreign relations and mutual agreements that could put them back on track toward stable economic growth, there's no guarantee. US-based companies have often complained about how much harder it's become to conduct business in China. Their government has placed a strong focus on their national security, leading to Chinese authorities conducting raids on American companies, even sometimes going as far as detaining personnel. The geopolitical landscape of the world plays a huge role in the decision-making of companies and their investors. Given the state of its economy and the uncertainty over how well it'll work with America, many companies have to choose whether they funnel money into China's economy and if they can continue to rely on it for exports. It's difficult to say whether China's appeal to the U.S. will pay off. It's no secret that the United States has felt threatened by China's growth, and whether or not this would impede their supporting efforts to help restabilize China's economy. The United States isn't known to budge, meaning they're unlikely to change their policies that have been targeting China's technology advances in order to slow them down. This unwillingness to relent gives China very little incentive to make compromises, regardless of their own ongoing economic issues. Not to mention, the U.S., like many other parts of the world, is also still trying to recover from the financial impact of the pandemic too, given how far-reaching its consequences were. There is a lot at stake for China, economically speaking. There are millions of jobs within the country that rely heavily on continued global trade and selling goods to other countries. As the world's largest trading nation, it falls to China to ensure that they're allowing the systems of global trade to continue to work. However, even if they are trying to play nice with the United States, there's always the concern that the U.S. won't want to reciprocate. China is watching the war in Ukraine closely. It has plans, big plans, and they hinge on the war coming to a quick end without a clear Ukrainian victory. For China, Russia doesn't have to win, but it can't suffer a total defeat either. A key component of their plan hinges on what happens next in Ukraine. Since the beginning of the war, China has been somewhat standoffish about its position and how far it's willing to go to support Russia. Chinese leadership backs Russia not because they're best friends or share the same ideology, but because China can't let the West, especially the United States, extend its influence any further than it already has. This is why China has been calling for negotiations and a ceasefire to end the conflict in Ukraine. However, they also hold the stipulation that Russia should be able to maintain control of certain territories that it invaded, even if they were seized illegally. What game is China playing? Why have they suddenly become more vocal about an agreement being reached to end the war? It probably comes as little surprise that China has a sinister reason for wanting peace between Russia and Ukraine, and it's not what you might think. Let's start by understanding China's stance on the war and how it sees Russia as a cog in its greater plans for dominance. China believes that the blame for what's happening in Ukraine belongs to multiple parties. The first is Russia, who, although China still supports, is not completely happy with. There's no denying that Russia was the aggressor in the conflict, and China has even said as much. However, they also place just as much blame on the West, and in particular the United States, for what's happening in Ukraine. This is because China claims the West has consistently ignored Russia's security concerns. The threat to Russia's way of life due to the encroachment of NATO and Western powers closer to their borders is the reason that Russia had to invade Ukraine. At least this is what China stated. They stand behind the notion that the security of every country should be considered by taking into account the interest and concerns of all parties involved. China stands by the belief that the West dominating Eastern Europe and spreading its influence closer and closer to Russia led to the inevitable invasion of Ukraine. Putin's hands were tied because he needed to protect Russian interests, and since the West wouldn't listen to his concerns, the only thing he could do was invade Ukraine. Again, this is what China says happened, but take it with a grain of salt because, of course, there is much more going on. Although there might be some truth to what China is claiming, NATO trying to weaken Russia and spread Western influence throughout Europe is not exactly what was happening. Even so, it's hard to argue that a power-hungry tyrant such as Vladimir Putin had the Russian people's best interest at heart when he invaded Ukraine. Now, China has laid out some key tenets that will drive its global policies and decisions in the coming years. A lot of what China wants hinges on the war coming to a swift end without Russia suffering a total defeat. At this point, all indications point to an eventual Ukrainian victory. It's only a matter of time before NATO tanks, modern weapons, and further aid reach the Ukrainian military. China knows this, which is why they're pushing for negotiations now. Russia losing the war by force and being completely pushed out of Ukraine would be very bad for China. Therefore, the peace talks they're hoping for will end with Russia maintaining some kind of control in parts of Ukraine. We know that this is not an option for President Volodymyr Zelensky. For him and the rest of Ukraine's citizens, there are only two options. Either Russian forces leave willingly, or they should be prepared to fight until the last soldier dies on the battlefield. Ukraine will not allow Russia to control any of its territory, including Crimea, any longer. And the truth is, they don't have to. Ukraine will almost certainly win the war with the help of Western powers. This is why China is scrambling to broker some kind of deal, where Russia isn't faced with total defeat. Fu Kong, the Chinese ambassador to the EU, recently voiced his country's concerns over what a complete victory in Ukraine would mean for the geopolitical state of the world. His statements were carefully worded, but it was clear that there were underlying threats in what the ambassador was saying, especially when he brought up another part of the world that China has had its sights on for some time now. Before we get to these threats, let's dive deeper into why exactly China doesn't want Ukraine to win the war. It actually has very little to do with their ties to Russia or any interest they have in the region itself. Instead, there's a much broader net China wishes to cast, and it can only do so if Ukraine doesn't claim complete victory. In his speech to the European Policy Center, Fu Shong said, "Frankly speaking, we are quite concerned about the possible escalation of this conflict. This may indicate that China doesn't want to see Russia rolling out its nuclear arsenal in a last-ditch effort to win the war. Since China has much closer ties to Putin than the West does, they may know something we don't. But it's more likely that China is just using the threat of escalation as a scare tactic to try to bring Ukraine to the negotiating table with an open mind." It's also no coincidence that Fu Chong's speech occurred at the same time that President Zelensky was set to visit London on his first trip to Western Europe since the war started. China likes to time its statements, military drills, and political decisions to coincide with events they do not agree with. It's their passive-aggressive way of voicing their displeasure without instigating full-fledged conflicts. Fu Chong also reiterated President Xi Jinping's sentiments that when looking at the current crisis and any such event that might arise in the future, global power should take the security concerns of both sides into consideration, not just those that are closely allied with the West. China suggests that this may reduce the risk of conflict down the road. Maybe they're right, but the fact that China also has its own agenda means that their advice also needs to be taken with a grain of salt. And this is where the crux of the situation lies. China does not want to see Ukraine win the conflict because it's currently engaged in a delicate balancing act. China has closely allied itself with Russia, less because the leaders of each country see eye to eye, and more because China needs help combating the economic, military, and political dominance the United States and European nations have around the world. Russia has acted like a buffer between China and the West, both literally and metaphorically. Russia's powerful military, economy, and influence, at least on paper, kept the West in check and made sure they didn't overextend into parts of the world that might cause international conflict. This included much of Asia, which allowed China some freedom to increase its own power and influence in the region, because the United States and its allies couldn't be everywhere at once. It also didn't hurt that the combined strength of Russia and China was a formidable power to contend with, and if none of those deterrents worked, Russia was more than willing to threaten to blow up the world with nukes, which seemed to keep the West from pushing their luck. China's concerned that if Ukraine wins the war and completely defeats Russia, Moscow will need to make concessions. In a worst-case scenario, this could lead to the installation of a regime that's much more lenient toward the West's expanding influence. Or, in China's biggest nightmare, the Russian Federation could collapse into civil war, and the outcome could be a democratic republic arising that becomes part of the very ideology that China opposes. The real reason that China wants a ceasefire and peace talks to be initiated between Russia and Ukraine is out of fear. China is afraid of the West becoming more powerful. They're afraid that a Russian defeat could lead to Western influence spreading closer to their borders, and they're afraid that everything they've worked so hard to achieve and becoming a dominant player on the world stage will be lost. The fear is real for China. Russia will likely not be the only nation that loses power and influence if Ukraine wins the war. All of their allies, including China, will need to rethink how they conduct themselves on the world stage. Ukraine is proving that Russia was not nearly as strong and powerful as everyone believed. With this illusion broken, China is incredibly scared that the West could be emboldened to dominate Asia by spreading its ideology across the continent. So the best case scenario right now is for China to advocate for a ceasefire to help Russia save face. They also want the war to end in a way that will hopefully keep Putin in power, or at least see him replaced by a regime that's still staunchly against the spread of Western influence. However, China has decided it won't throw its full official support behind Russia. Its government has remained relatively silent about the war up to now because it doesn't want to suffer similar sanctions from the West as Russia is. The main goal is to keep China's influence and economy growing, which is not contingent on Russia's success. However, it is contingent on Western powers being kept in check, especially in Asia. In fact, China knows its future actually lies in its ability to sell technology, goods, and labor to the West. China's economy will continue to grow only if it maintains some kind of partnership between themselves, Europe, and the United States. But if Russia falls, it could lead to the West asking for too many concessions from China in the future. It's also likely that China never saw Russia as a major player in their plans to grow. It was nice to have Russia as a buffer and for extra security when things became dicey in parts of Central Asia, such as Afghanistan or Syria. However, in terms of growing China's economy and spreading its influence, Russia had very little purpose. That being said, China's Belt and Road Initiative to connect their nation to Europe via a network of roads and railways has come under threat. This is a minor setback, as the completion of this transportation network isn't contingent on Russia winning the war. However, progress has slowed as men and resources are sent to the front lines to aid in the war effort. If China can manage to initiate peace talks, it'll still lead to a further weakening of Russia. However, that might be okay, because a weakened Russia is a Russia that will be even more reliant on China. This will only strengthen the growth of their economy. But until they can get Russia out of the war, China's plans to extend its influence and trade network to European markets will continue to stall. But even a weakened Russia is better than no Russia at all. Again, it all comes back to the buffer between China and the West. As long as Russia can maintain its autonomy and still has the threat of launching nuclear warheads at its enemies, NATO will probably only push its luck so far when it comes to establishing military bases and conducting operations in Asia. A total defeat of Russia in Ukraine could jeopardize the status quo, which would cause serious security concerns for the Chinese government. It is interesting to note that China doesn't necessarily want to dominate the world. What it's really seeking is a multipolar order. What this means is that China wants to be the United States' equal, not a nation that it's trying to play catch-up to. The US is the only superpower in the world. China wants to join this exclusive club to spread its own ideologies and influence. Obviously, the US doesn't want a multipolar system, as it would then no longer be able to influence geopolitics unimpeded. However, not everyone in the world agrees with the Western way of life. There are plenty of countries that probably wish there was someone to challenge the United States so it would stop building military bases wherever it wanted, while also exploiting other nations' resources, but this is a discussion for another time. What is important is that China wants to be able to compete with the US's economic and political power. Would President Xi Jinping like to rule the world? Probably. However, as of right now, China's goal is to create a multipolar system where it's able to compete with the United States by becoming the world's second superpower. If Russia collapses due to a total defeat in Ukraine, this goal could be put in serious jeopardy. Everything discussed thus far has to do with China's fear that a Russian defeat in the war will lead to the spread of Western ideology further into Asia. But at the beginning of this video, we mentioned there was something more sinister going on. Buckle in, because during his statement declaring China's desire to see a ceasefire, Fu Kong also made it clear that something more alarming was brewing near China's borders. Fu Kong warned senior officials from the EU and other Western powers that they should stop sending delegations to Taiwan. China continuously claims that the island of Taiwan is part of its territory, even though most of the world, including Taiwan itself, identifies the island as a sovereign nation called the Republic of China. Fu Kong was also adamant that there could be no comparison between what Russia was doing to Ukraine and China's actions toward Taiwan. He said, "I must state up front that the Ukrainian crisis and the Taiwan issue are two completely different things. Ukraine is an independent state and Taiwan is part of China, so there's no comparability between the two issues." And yet, they are very much the same. Russia claimed that Ukraine was rightfully part of their territory, so they invaded. China claims that Taiwan is rightfully part of its territory, so if they invade, it would almost be the exact same series of events that have been unfolding between Russia and Ukraine over the past year. Even if Fu Kong and the rest of the Chinese leadership deny all similarities, they must know deep down that if they took military action against Taiwan, the response from the West would not just be similar, but more extreme than what has been happening to Russia. Perhaps China's been taking detailed notes on what the West is willing to do and how far they're willing to go to stop a rival power from claiming territory. China's seen that the US and NATO will send monetary and military aid to Taiwan. China has watched as sanctions imposed by the West have slowly begun to cripple the Russian economy. And as Russia is pushed further and further out of Ukrainian territory, China is watching the repercussions that the invasion will have on Russia's influence in the world. Maybe China advocating for a ceasefire is just a ploy to see if there will be any leniency given to Russia for their actions. China must know that if they invade Taiwan, it will lead to war. And if the United States steps in, it'll be a war that China cannot win. There's little doubt that China wants the world to acknowledge their rule over Taiwan, but unless they take it by force, this will likely never happen. This is why Fu Kong left European leaders with a warning. If the European Union engages in investment treaties with Taiwan, it would fundamentally change or shake the foundation of the relationship between the EU and China. Whether this is an empty threat or if China will take drastic actions to keep Western powers from becoming closer to Taiwan is unclear. However, the fact is that this is all being discussed while China is calling for a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia is a telling sign. China is in a tough spot. Its strongest ally is about to be defeated in a war that it started. Its biggest enemies are only becoming bolder because of what's happening in Ukraine. China's ambitions to become a superpower are slowly slipping away the closer Ukraine comes to winning. However, it's not all doom and gloom. China has benefited from this war. As sanctions were imposed on Russia, it drove the country right into China's arms. Anything Russia needed, they had to get from their allies, and China was more than happy to sell them the goods. This gave China an economic boost at a time it desperately needed it. The war also allowed China to watch the West's reaction to an invasion, which provided valuable data to the future if they ever decided to seize land from one of their neighbors. China saw how slow NATO was to provide the necessary weapons and equipment Ukraine required, but eventually they did come. This information may be used in any future plans that China makes for securing Taiwan or expanding its borders in other ways. China also now knows what kind of sanctions and the limits to which the West is willing to go to punish a nation for invading another. And while the world is focused on Ukraine, China has been sneakily expanding its influence in Oceania and South Asia. The United States and the EU have sent so much aid and supplies to Ukraine that they don't have the resources to keep China in check in East Asia and the Pacific. Bloody conflicts have broken out along the Himalayan border between Chinese Tibet and India. The Chinese Navy is commissioning new ships and new trade relations are being forged between China and the countries around them. If China was using the war in Ukraine to gather intelligence, plan for the future, and strengthen its position in Asia, it has succeeded. Now, China is trying to persuade Russia and Ukraine to stop fighting so the new status quo can develop. If things go too far and Ukraine completely defeats Russia, it will jeopardize China's future plans. The past has been a balancing act between strengthening their ties with other non-Western nations to increase their influence close to home and keeping a buffer between themselves and Western nations. China's biggest fear if Ukraine wins the war is that Russia will either collapse or a pro-Western regime will replace Putin. Both of these things would allow the United States and the EU to expand their influence into Asia and threaten everything China has been working so hard to achieve. For those of us who live in the West, this is not something we worry about, but Russia losing the war could threaten the power that the leaders in China now hold. This is why China wants peace in Ukraine. It's afraid that if Russia loses, they will too. The Chinese economy is stagnating. The prices of goods are plummeting. While most of the world's economies are battling inflation, China has a different problem, one that could be much worse. China's economy is experiencing deflation. This is both good and bad news for the world. Good because it means Chinese products are becoming cheaper, and bad because deflation may lead to a collapse of the second largest economy on the planet. If this were to happen, the world could be thrown into chaos, and every nation on Earth would feel its impact. Before we examine what's happening in China, we need to understand what deflation is. As the name suggests, it's the opposite of inflation. But what does that actually mean? And is it a good or a bad thing? We'll also need to analyze the causes and consequences of deflation before taking a deep dive into what is happening in China. This is a cautionary tale and one that every government should heed. Inflation is a huge problem for many economies right now, but if governments aren't careful and they overshoot their goals of getting prices under control, a much different problem might develop. At a basic level, deflation is when the prices of a country's goods decrease over time while purchasing power increases. You can think of it as the opposite of inflation in this way. When inflation occurs, prices of everyday goods such as foods, electronics, and housing increase. This means that consumers need to pay more money than they had to in previous years to procure the same products. Another way of looking at it is that due to inflation, the consumer's paycheck, savings, or money in general just doesn't go as far as it used to. Deflation is the exact opposite. Deflation of an economy occurs when the overall price of goods decreases over time, which means people can buy the things they need or want for less money. Again, another way of thinking about this is that their money has a higher purchasing power because they can buy more things with the same amount of money than they could previously. The tricky part about deflation is that although it sounds great for consumers, it can be detrimental to the health of an economy. The most common effects of deflation, if not handled properly by the government, are a recession and a shrinking economy. One reason for this is that as prices steadily decrease, consumers tend to delay purchases to try to secure a better price in the future. This is especially true for large purchases such as homes, automobiles, and expensive goods. The downside to this reaction by consumers is that it results in less profit for companies that are then forced to lay off workers. Financial institutions also begin to raise interest rates as they need to increase their profits, as their holdings other than cash might be decreasing in value. If this series of events continues, it can lead to high unemployment along with high interest rates, which can bring an economy to a screeching halt. In essence, a negative feedback loop is generated. As more people lose their jobs, they put less money into the economy and they're unable to buy as many goods and services. This then drives prices even lower as demand is much lower than supply. Prices continue to drop, leading to more layoffs, causing worse deflation, and the cycle continues over and over again until the government enacts policies and procedures to stabilize the economy. The question now becomes, what causes deflation, and is there any way for China to snap its economy out of it? There are two major causes of deflation. The first is when demand decreases in a country. For example, if consumers are worried about their financial future, they might begin to save more and spend less. This can happen if citizens don't have faith in their government or if a problem with the economy is looming on the horizon. In times of financial uncertainty, people who would normally be pumping money into the economy and buying goods might transfer their hard-earned cash into savings accounts to incur interest or create a fund to offer some kind of support cushion if things go bad. Demand can be stifled by several factors. If the government and financial institutions decide to raise interest rates, more people will save their cash and take out fewer loans. High interest rates almost always result in lower borrowing rates, and when consumers borrow less, they spend less on goods and services, which drives demand down further and further. Then there are large-scale events that are bad for the economy and therefore cause people to spend less out of uncertainty for the future, such as the global pandemic. People buy less because they're unsure if they'll be employed in the future. Economic and financial unpredictability almost always lead to consumers spending less and saving more. When this happens on a large scale for long periods of time, it can cause an economy to experience deflation. The second cause of deflation is if there's a sudden growth in supply and not enough demand to keep up with it. If companies find they're ending up with excess supply quarter after quarter, they will decrease the price of their products in order to sell them. This may lead to decreased profit or even a loss, but it becomes necessary if there's an excess of supply. Then there is the competition. If consumers are buying fewer goods than they had previously, the result is higher competition between companies offering the same or similar goods. This causes businesses to undercut prices in order to secure buyers. As one company cuts prices, others will follow to stay competitive. This snowballs into more price cuts, and the price of goods continues to decrease, resulting in deflation. The components necessary to build products will also decrease in cost with deflation. This allows companies to produce their commodities more cheaply, thereby giving them the ability to lower prices even more. A reduction in production cost results in a decrease in prices, which can then drive deflation in the economy. All of these things can result in more and more supply while demand remains low. So what are the actual consequences of deflation? We know what it is and why it happens, but how bad can deflation actually be for an economy and a country as a whole? It certainly is tempting to view a decrease in prices as a good thing if you're a consumer. And to be fair, having your money go further is a good feeling for most people. However, when deflation of an entire economy occurs, the results can be truly devastating. As we mentioned before, unemployment tends to go up in a deflated economy. This is because as prices decrease, profits decrease. Businesses cannot employ the same number of people if they're not increasing revenue and growing, so workers must be laid off. This is an inevitability in an economy that's going through deflation. And again, when people are nervous about their employment status being in jeopardy, they are going to spend less and save more. Then there's debt. Almost every nation in the world has external debt. This is because we live in a global economy and governments incur debt by taking out loans and borrowing money from external lenders to fund their own economic activity and public investments. governments, as well as to increase employment. For example, the United States holds the largest amount of external debt in the world at around $24.5 trillion. The countries with the next largest external debt are the United Kingdom with $8.73 trillion in debt, France with around $7 trillion, Germany with $6.5 trillion, Japan with $4.36 trillion, and Canada with $3.2 trillion. China has the seventh most external debt in the world with around $2.64 trillion. The problem with having external debt and an economy experiencing deflation is that the country may be seen as a risk by foreign governments. This could result in the devaluation of a nation's currency, which is somewhat ironic, as deflation causes the purchasing power of the currency in the nation to grow stronger. However, on a global scale, deflation can decrease the value of the currency, which leads to problems when countries have to pay back some of that debt. The real issue with deflation is that there isn't a simple fix. It's a multifaceted and complicated economic situation for a nation to be in. The combination of low demand, employment uncertainty, and increased purchasing power continuously drives prices down. This, in turn, causes businesses to enact layoffs and lower their prices even further to get rid of supply, which can then cause the economy to come to a grinding halt. This is known as a deflationary spiral, and it's the reason why if deflation is not handled properly, it can lead to an economic recession. Now, let's look at China's specific case. This won't be the first time an influential economy has experienced deflation, and it certainly won't be the last. What has many analysts nervous and why we're keeping an eye on the situation in China is that it has the second largest economy in the world, with a GDP of around $17.8 trillion. Any problems in the Chinese economy will have ramifications for economies across the world, so let's find out what exactly is going on in China and how it'll affect the country where you live. When Chinese economic data was reported from the past few years, a few alarming numbers came to light. In 2020, both the Consumer Price Index and the Producer Price Index in the country started and have continued to trend negatively. The Consumer Price Index measures the changes in prices over time that consumers pay for goods and services. So, since the Consumer Price Index is going down, it means the average Chinese citizen is paying less for the things they purchase. The Producer Price Index measures the change in price that domestic producers receive for the goods and services they create. This number decreased for the past 10 consecutive months, from 4.4% to 4.1%. This means that goods in China are becoming cheaper. Both of these numbers show that the Chinese economy is experiencing deflation. China is the first G20 country to have a year-on-year decline in consumer prices since August of 2021, when Japan experienced the same phenomenon. China is the world's largest trading nation. In 2022, it's estimated that China exported $3.6 trillion worth of goods to countries around the world. Therefore, the price of manufactured goods and products in China has a direct impact on economies across the planet. As of 2023, it seems that Chinese exports are down by approximately 14.5%, and imports dropped by 12.4%. This is a huge decrease in exports, which is now having a drastic effect on the Chinese economy. The grim trade data reinforces concerns that the country's economic growth could slow further this year. Analysts believe that the recent property crisis in China may be one of the main factors causing deflation. As consumers, companies, and investors become more wary about unsold buildings and property, they are starting to spend and invest less. Beijing has continuously lowered interest rates and promised that real estate is still a good investment, but this doesn't seem to be the case, and Beijing is just scrambling to try to stabilize the situation. Also, the spending habits of consumers in China were very different post-pandemic than in most other countries. A majority of nations around the world saw consumer spending boom after the pandemic as people who had saved up while in lockdown began to splurge. This led to a supply issue as demand was so high producers couldn't keep up. In turn, this caused the prices of goods to skyrocket, which has led to inflation in many parts of the world. In China, it appears the opposite has happened. China remained locked down and had harsher COVID restrictions than most nations. However, once they were lifted, the price of goods did not increase in the country. Instead, prices began to fall as of February 2021. In retrospect, it seems the economy was on the brink of deflation for months due to weak demand for goods from Chinese citizens. And even when all restrictions were lifted, people didn't start spending their saved money in the same way residents of other countries did. There was no boom in demand, and therefore, supply increased. Chinese companies began lowering their prices to try to entice consumers to start buying, but it didn't work. Deflation continued, and now it looks like the Chinese economy could be in big trouble. Government debt is growing at unprecedented rates, while unemployment, especially in the younger generations, has hit a record high. Now, 12 million college graduates are looking for jobs that just don't exist, or if they do, they're not paying well enough. One of the problems with the enormous economic success that China has had over the last few decades is that more and more money has poured into the country. This has allowed a middle class to develop and higher-paying jobs to become more plentiful. But this success may be leading to China's downfall as companies are struggling to find new employees to work in factories and manufacturing facilities. The younger generations have grown up experiencing the economic success of their nation, and now they're not settling for minimum wage jobs in factories with horrible working conditions. Unfortunately, many recent graduates might not have much of a choice if the Chinese economy continues to trend downwards. But this is exactly what we would expect to see in a country that's experiencing deflation, high unemployment, and low prices. These two factors are also making it harder and harder for China to lower its debt. While Beijing tries to solve the deflation problems, the Chinese economy is growing more slowly than in the past and could eventually stall. And as real estate companies in China continue to collapse, consumers are holding on more tightly to their money while the government tries to get things under control. Unsurprisingly, Beijing claims there's nothing wrong. The leadership has told the Chinese people and all the world that its economy is stronger than ever and will continue to grow, even though all economic data suggests that deflation might hold it back. It's not entirely clear why, but Beijing hasn't enacted countermeasures to try to address the deflation issue. Perhaps they're afraid that if they start implementing ways to get citizens to spend more money and pump funds into their economy, then they'll have to admit that something's wrong. There's also the real possibility that Beijing only believes what it wants to believe and that they aren't doing anything because they truly think everything's okay. This seems unlikely as there are clear indicators that the Chinese economy is slowing as consumer prices decrease and employment opportunities are becoming more scarce. Liu Guochang, the deputy governor of the People's Bank of China, has stated that there will be no signs of deflationary risk by the end of 2023. Instead of facing the truth, Beijing keeps on insisting that the Chinese economy just needs more time to recover from the pandemic. Unfortunately for China, this is not what most economists outside of the People's Republic believe. It appears the Chinese economy is exhibiting almost every trait of deflation, and the reality is that deflation is not going away unless the government does something about it. But since Beijing seems to be sitting on its hands and refusing to acknowledge the elephant in the room, the next several years might be exceedingly rough for the Chinese economy. But what does this mean for the rest of the world? Will the deflation of China's economy cause a massive disruption to other economies across the planet? Surprisingly, China's deflation could be good news for other nations. Many economists have noted that deflation in China will actually help combat inflation in the United States and Europe. If cheaper Chinese goods are being imported and sold in the countries, it could lower prices and dial back inflation. However, there are several factors that suggest deflation in China will only have a very minor effect on reducing inflation in other economies across the world. For example, Chinese exports like furniture and apparel only make up less than 10% of goods affected by inflation. Things like housing, food, energy, and medical care make up the bulk of goods and services that have been hit hard by inflation, none of which is connected to cheaper goods coming from China. And even though China's deflation might help reduce inflation in certain circumstances, some governments would rather wait out inflation than speed up its decline by importing Chinese goods. For example, the United States has placed crippling tariffs on many Chinese goods to make them less enticing for buyers and to persuade U.S. citizens to buy more products made in the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. In 2018, President Donald Trump's administration started to bombard Chinese imports with massive tariffs. In response, China implemented its own tariffs on U.S. goods. This went back and forth for a while, resulting in around $335 billion in trade, or about 66.4% of China's exports to the U.S. being subject to tariffs. The average U.S. tariff on Chinese goods is now approximately 19.3%, while Beijing has settled on an average tariff of 21.2% for American goods. The result of this tariff war was an 8.5% reduction in trade from China to the U.S. and a 26.3% decrease in trade from the U.S. to China. And since the Biden administration hasn't rolled back any of the tariffs thus far, it's become too expensive for many U.S. companies to import products from China while keeping their costs competitive. This has resulted in businesses looking elsewhere to secure goods and labor, which has only exacerbated China's decrease in trade with the U.S. This has slowed the Chinese economy's recovery from the pandemic and might even play a role in the surplus goods that Chinese companies now have, which is one factor contributing to deflation. Rather than taking advantage of the extremely low prices of Chinese goods, the United States has doubled down on tariffs, and to be fair, the U.S. doesn't really need to purchase Chinese goods to help lower inflation as the interest rate hikes by the federal government seem to have gotten it under control. There's also a downside to cheap Chinese goods flooding the global market as Beijing tries to jumpstart its economy and offload oversupply. Nations that are willing to purchase inexpensive Chinese products might end up hurting their own manufacturing sectors. This could result in fewer investments at home and a decrease in growth and employment. A massive amount of cheap Chinese exports spreading across the world could have very real negative effects on both developed and developing economies. If China can convince other nations to buy more and more of its goods, it might be able to pull its economy out of the deflation spiral at the expense of saturating the global market and causing other economies to shrink. This is why governments around the world need to keep a close eye on what China's doing and introduce trade policies that will not hurt businesses within their own borders. For some, like the US, this is not an issue. However, for developing economies, cheap Chinese goods might be too enticing to pass up. Before we discuss how China can slow and even stop deflation of their economy, we need to touch on some other key factors in the process. We know that China's economy is experiencing deflation because its aggregate consumer price index has been decreasing steadily over several quarters. But we need to make a distinction between deflation, which is bad for an economy, and disinflation, which is good. These two economic terms may seem similar, but there are some very key differences. Almost everyone knows and has experienced at some point recently, inflation is miserable. It hurts the economy, businesses, and the consumer. However, deflation is not the answer to inflation. Inflation is a natural process in a thriving economy that needs to be managed. Problems occur when inflation rises too quickly. When there's a slow, steady rise in inflation, it often signifies that an economy is healthy and growing. Disinflation is when prices rise over time, but do so more slowly than when there are high levels of inflation. You can think of it like this. When inflation is high, a government wants to get it under control as quickly as possible. However, if done too hastily, increased interest rates and taxes can cause an economy suffering from inflation to collapse and plummet into a recession. Instead, what the government wants to do is implement a series of tax and interest rate hikes slowly over time to get inflation under control. For example, if the annual inflation rate decreases from 4% to 2%, this is disinflation, as inflation is still present, but at a much more manageable rate. The key difference between disinflation and deflation is that during deflation, goods decrease in price rather than rising in price slower than during inflation. Let's imagine a hypothetical cell phone that cost $100. If disinflation was occurring and the annual inflation rate went from 4% to 2%, this phone would have been predicted to cost $104 but would end up only costing $102. The phone still costs more next year than the year before, but the increased cost would be less because inflation was less. With a 2% deflation, that same phone would cost $98 the following year. Again, this might seem great for consumers, but it's all the other baggage that comes with deflation, such as decreased profit, layoffs, and reduced spending, that can result in an economy slowing down. There are a few things the Chinese government, and any government for that matter, can do to combat deflation. The first is to increase the supply of money through government buybacks. This is a balancing act, as the goal is to infuse money into the economy without devaluing it too greatly or too quickly. A sudden influx of too much cash could cause the value of a currency to plummet. If done right, buying back securities will encourage people to spend more money while also slowly raising prices. Both of these things need to happen in order for a deflated economy to grow. The government could also make borrowing easier by lowering interest rates or asking banks to increase the amount of credit people have access to. Another option is lowering the reserve rate for banks, which indicates how much cash each institution must have on hand at any given time. The lower the reserve rate, the more money banks can loan out, which can then be used by consumers to spend on commodities. On top of these actions, the government can lower taxes, which provides households with more disposable income and allows them to spend more. All of these things will result in prices increasing as demand increases. Basically, in order to combat deflation, the government does the exact opposite of what it would do to slow inflation. There are a few reasons why deflation may actually be more dangerous than inflation. As mentioned before, moderate inflation is part of a healthy, growing economy. However, deflation is almost never an indicator of a strong economy. Consumers can often protect themselves against inflation by investing money in the stock market, bonds, or interest-bearing accounts that will allow their money to grow over time. The hope is that the interest and dividends you receive will outpace inflation. In a stable economy, this often works, and even during times of economic turmoil or recessions, investing tends to be worthwhile in the long run. Deflation, on the other hand, often spirals into a recession or even a depression, which is much harder to predict and plan for. Debt that a consumer already has becomes harder to pay off when deflation occurs due to economic uncertainty and declining liquidity. When deflation is happening, people tend to put their money in cash investments, which do not earn as much over time and therefore hurt consumers down the road. This brings us back to what China should be doing right now. Let's start by saying doing nothing is a really bad option. By pretending everything is okay, Beijing may be digging its own economic grave. As the price of goods continues to decrease and supply grows, Chinese companies are going to have to start laying people off. China is still the most populous country in the world, with around 1.412 billion people. That's a lot of individuals who need jobs to support their families. And although there are other opportunities outside of manufacturing, China's economy is still heavily dependent on this sector. If Chinese companies start laying off workers to cut costs as a result of lower prices, China could be headed for a truly horrific economic crisis. Policymakers in Beijing still maintain that China's deflation period will be over within the next 6 to 12 months, and that the lowering of prices and the stagnation of the economy is just a side effect of the pandemic. Maybe they're right, but it's worth noting that almost every other developed economy is experiencing high inflation right now as a result of the pandemic. Some steps are being taken to boost the Chinese economy, but they're not necessarily addressing the real problem. Beijing has announced that China will increase the sales of cars and appliances within its borders while also making the housing market more stable and affordable. Most experts agree this likely won't fix the deflation problem and will probably only put a band-aid on the growing problem. If China has any hope of reversing deflation, consumers need to start spending money. This will only happen if they feel confident that the government and the economy are strong. The first thing that Beijing needs to do is regain the trust of private businesses so they'll continue to hire new workers and grow. This will allow their employees to spend more money and increase cash flowing to the economy. Many analysts have also suggested that China will need to enact tax cuts if there's any hope of encouraging people to spend their hard-earned paychecks instead of keeping them in their savings. If the government can get its citizens to start spending and businesses to stabilize their prices, then investors will once again begin putting money into the Chinese economy. In order for this to happen, Beijing might need to inject government money into the economy through a stimulus package or incentives for investors and businesses. The situation in China is slightly different than in Western democracies, as the CCP government has much more control over what is done in the private sector, along with how people live their lives. Therefore, it's on Beijing to fix the deflation of the economy by taking action. What it comes down to is that deflation can be very dangerous for an economy, and China is in the throes of a deflation spiral. Unless the government acts soon, the economy could go to recession, which might send the global markets into turmoil. At this point, every economy in the world is connected in one way or another. The problem is that China has the second largest economy in the world, which means that if something goes wrong, it will be felt by markets across the planet. Unfortunately, there's not much anyone can do to help China. If Beijing wants to save its economy, it needs to lower its interest rates, decrease taxes, and offer some kind of stimulus package. If this does not happen, the Chinese economy could be facing a recession or even a depression in the near future. Will an all-new global reserve currency overthrow the mighty dollar? A well-respected media outlet just said the U.S. is doing its best, or worst, to debase and dethrone the almighty dollar. Is the U.S. really inflicting damage on its own currency? Hold on to your hats, but possibly not your dollars, as we explain everything in this video today. If you believe the doomsday preachers, there's a possibility that something might happen in the near future that will make the 2008 economic crash look like a walk in the park. But before we get to that, we might ask why currencies can tank. We'll start with the really extreme example of Germany, but it serves as an interesting story of how things can go very wrong very quickly. Great economies and their currencies have tanked before, as happened to Germany in the 1920s, and it all happened because of inflation or hyperinflation. Generally, normal inflation is about 2% yearly. When it becomes hyperinflation, it could be 50% a month or as much as 14,000% per year. The Investopedia website just asked if the U.S. is headed toward hyperinflation. The article cited an economic analyst who said hyperinflation will eventually hit the U.S. when the American people decide they would rather live their lives as free rather than as slaves to an unpayable national debt, whose interest will eventually consume more of the federal budget than the military expenditures. Let that sink in. But for now, let's not just laugh off the possibility of hyperinflation in the US of A. Let's now look at the extreme example of Germany in detail. There's a story that a man went to a baker with a wheelbarrow full of cash. He was using it to buy a loaf of bread. But while he was talking to the baker, someone stole his parked wheelbarrow and left all the money behind. That's hyperinflation, the extreme version. At the time, the newspaper correspondent for The Guardian said she had to go to a tailor to make some small alterations to her clothes. She was charged 24 billion marks. This was in a country that had been one of the strongest economies in the world less than a decade earlier, when $1 was worth around 4 to 5 marks. The inflation started during World War I, when Germany was printing money and borrowing money to pay for its costly military expenditures. The plan was to win the war and demand reparations from the vanquished countries, but as you know, it's not how things worked out. Note, sometimes things can go very wrong very quickly. Under the Treaty of Versailles, after Germany had lost the war, it was hit with overly severe reparations that some people said would create so much hardship that Germany would one day fight back. Lo and behold, it happened when Adolf Hitler came on the scene and told everyone that he would make things right again. In the early 1920s, the marks per dollar rose to 2,000 marks, and then to 20,000, to a million, and up and up. It increased so fast that the waiters at restaurants had to stand up and shout to all the customers about the new prices on the menu. Kids started playing with money like it was nothing, making kites out of bills. The German government told printing companies to make more printing machines and print more and more money. It became worthless. The public started bartering for goods with anything but money, cigarettes, or anything they owned. The cheapest wallpaper was made out of money. Housewives used bills to light their stoves. If you print a lot of money, you might have a temporary positive effect, but the prices of goods and services will soon increase. Money becomes less valuable, and people try to offload it. Chaos ensues. The banks might have to print larger denominations. When hyperinflation began in Zimbabwe in 2007, they printed the largest denomination bill in history, a crisp $100 trillion bill. More recently in Venezuela, they had removed 6 zeros from the currency so the average purchase wouldn't involve hundreds of trillions of Venezuelan bolivars. Many countries had a dark era in their history when they experienced hyperinflation, including China, France, Vietnam, Argentina, Poland, the Soviet Union, Hungary, and Greece. Notably, the USA is not on that list, and most people don't expect it to be anytime soon, but some do. How extreme it will be if it does indeed happen is anyone's guess. One of these doomers in the US gives advice on offshore banking and how to get a hold of a second passport and buying gold or offshore real estate. He talks about massive inflation, saying the same will occur in Europe and America in the fairly near future. It's not a Chicken Little overreaction, it's a virtual certainty. The same economic errors always bring the same catastrophic results. He talks about the U.S. national debt, which according to a debt clock online stands at $31.4 trillion as we write this show. For each U.S. citizen, it's a debt of around $94,000. The doomer says the debt is some $100 trillion when adding unfunded liabilities. The Wall Street Journal also said that writing in 2022, how much Washington really owes is $100 trillion. This includes the U.S. debt obligations in the future, such as pension plans. The money is owed, but it's not covered. This is very important in the show today. The world's eyes are on the U.S.'s economy, and some say that the U.S. is a ship lost at sea sailing into a storm it hasn't prepared for. The doomer analyst is not by himself in saying the crash is coming, and it's going to be one hell of a crazy time in the USA as people see their dollars turn to pennies. The economist Peter Schiff, aka Dr. Doom, just said in a podcast, inflation is probably a bigger threat now than it's ever been, and therefore it's an even bigger factor in determining everything we do. To some people, he's a well-respected economist who predicted the 2008 crash, but to others, he's wildly wrong in his assertions. He said the current generation is going to pay for the economic mismanagement of the older generation. He explained that hyperinflation might well come to the USA, saying the young generation is just going to leave the country if things get that bad. He doesn't blame China for this collapse, but he does see people offloading dollars and buying yuan, euros, or gold. He said he's predicted what's happening now and believes we're at a point now where inflation is about to run out of control. It's still early, he said, but things are going to implode. Are these people saying too many negatives, or do they have a point? Remember, Schiff is nicknamed Dr. Doom. Plenty of people disagree with him. Still, even the former Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey believes something will happen, tweeting in 2021, hyperinflation is going to change everything. It's happening. He added it will happen in the US soon, and so the world. Schiff said yet again they're ignoring the problems, sailing into a dark economic storm. We're heading for a currency crisis, he said, which will mean the collapse of the dollar. You might be wondering where China comes in on this, and that'll be explained soon, but you first ought to know something about the US's national debt, since that's the one reason everyone's talking about economic doom. That $31 trillion number sounds pretty big. It is, actually, but does it really matter? Most countries have a national debt. According to Debt Clocks, the UK's debt is $2.6 trillion, Spain is about $1.3 trillion, Poland $510 billion, China is $10 trillion, Russia $1 trillion, India $2.5 trillion, Japan $4.8 trillion, Brazil $2 trillion. You get the point. The national debt is also measured by a percent of the GDP, which puts Japan at the top, around 259%. Sudan and Greece were the next two. The US was in 14th place, Canada 19th, and France in 20th. You might be looking at these countries and figures and think, well, national debt obviously doesn't mean much in terms of standard of living. Japan's a great place to live, highly advanced, with a crime rate that makes the USA look like Mordor. Still, that debt might not mean much now, but it might in the future. Some people are indeed concerned about it in the USA. The US has been hitting record highs. The national debt increased a whopping 800% from 1989 to 2021. The graph looks like the Everest Base Camp to Camp 1. It's not just doomers saying that this is bad. Some established economists are also saying that it's critical that this gets sorted out. There are many reasons the debt got this bad. Let's now give you a simple example of how the national debt is created. Let's imagine you're the next POTUS. You've been watching all those YouTube videos of American infrastructure collapsing because, of course, YouTube is where you go to get all your information about your country. You decide to fund a massive infrastructure project that costs billions, but you don't have a federal budget for it. Never mind, you think, so you decide to sell bonds to investors with an interest rate. But at some point, they might want their money with the interest. But guess what? You might not have enough money from taxes and other revenue sources, so what do? Issue more bonds, of course. Wars don't come cheap. Economic downturns can be a pain in the butt, a la COVID. Tax cuts might not help either. And what if you got lots of old people not working and you have things such as healthcare programs for all these people? The US is not looking good in the demographics department, which is one reason why some analysts say the national debt is set to skyrocket as we approach 2050. We're now talking base camp 1 to the death zone. The US is going to have a lot of old folks that are going to need a lot of healthcare, and some people say that tax revenue won't be enough. These old people won't be earning and innovating. And what happens when you have to pay off your debt? That, of course, can affect day-to-day life for the regular citizen. It might mean unaffordable healthcare, education standards lapse, infrastructure crumbles, and perhaps, just perhaps, there will be unpredictable security threats. The interest payments this year for the national debt added up to $395.5 billion, a huge amount, considering it was more than elementary and secondary education, agriculture, or science and space programs. It's much more than $100+ billion the U.S. spent in military aid to Ukraine. This is why a Pew Research poll said that 57% of Americans stated that addressing the national debt was a top priority. 25% said they somewhat agree it's a top priority, 11% said they somewhat disagree, and only 3% said they don't agree at all. 37% said they were somewhat optimistic the debt situation would improve, and 35% said they were somewhat pessimistic that things would improve. You also never know what might hit you. President Barack Obama increased the debt by $9.3 trillion in 8 years. He cut taxes and increased military spending, but after the 2008 crash, he introduced the very expensive American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. During Trump's presidency, the debt increased by $7.8 trillion, with the pandemic costing around $4 trillion. So far, under Biden, the debt has increased $3.7 trillion as of the making of this show. The debt is set to increase a lot more as time goes by, and it might not matter which political party is in charge. This does matter, according to many experts. The Balance website wrote, Congress knows a debt crisis isn't far away. In less than 20 years, the Social Security Trust Fund won't have enough to cover the retirement benefits promised to people born from 1946 to 1964. That could mean higher taxes once the high U.S. debt rules out further loans from other countries. About 1/5 of the debt is intra-governmental debt held by federal agencies and other entities. This is the money the government owes to itself, meaning that one part of the government owes it to another part. The rest of the debt is public debt, which can be owed to actual individuals, businesses, and more importantly, foreign governments. It includes treasury bonds, bills, and securities held by the Federal Reserve and foreign governments. This money was borrowed to keep things running smoothly in the USA. Okay, so which countries own the most U.S. debt? Japan sits at number 1, about $1.08 trillion of U.S. debt. China has about $870 billion, the UK $645 billion, and Belgium $332 billion. Moving on, the US dollar is still the world's reserve currency. Countries like dollars. Dollars are stable. They've been stable in the past, that is. The International Monetary Fund says that 59% of all foreign bank reserves are in US dollars. We'll make this next part short, but it's something you need to know. As you know, the UK was the world superpower at the start of the 20th century, but it got kicked around in 2 world wars, as did much of Europe, while the US was making hay as a manufacturing giant. It became the biggest supplier of weapons and other goods. Notwithstanding all the dead American soldiers, the wars were a boon time for the US. For instance, US exports were $2.4 billion in 1913 and rose to $6.2 billion in 1917. There was the Great Depression between the World Wars, but World War II stimulated the U.S. economy again. 17 million new jobs were created, and industrial productivity went up by 96%. It was 1944 at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire that 22 allied nations met to talk about how to stabilize the world economy. The U.S. was now the world's leading economy. It had the most of the gold in the world. It hadn't been destroyed like much of Europe. So it was decided that the U.S. dollar should be the world's reserve currency. Other currencies would be pegged to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate. Central banks were created. There was also the Marshall Plan, in which the U.S. aided the rebuilding of broken Europe, which further cemented the dollar as the aid was in dollars. Countries bought U.S. Treasury securities, which they deemed as a safe way of storing money. Things changed around the time of the Vietnam War when the dollar became less stable. That's when the floating exchange rates that we have today were introduced. So the dollar became the world's reserve currency. In the dollar we trust. God bless the dollar. But is that faith waning? It hasn't always been plain sailing for the American buck. Now and again, there's been talk of the euro becoming the reserve currency. After all, the euro makes up about 21% of international foreign currency reserves. The 27 countries of the EU are a force of economic nature, with a GDP of around $16.6 trillion in 2022. Still less than China's $17 trillion, and the US's $22 trillion. So again, have countries' faith in the dollar decreased? In 2009, China and Russia called for creating a new global reserve currency altogether independent of other currencies in the world. Notably, China was worried that the US dollar would lose value due to inflation, and China would be stuck with less valuable dollars. The IMF rejected the proposal. Still, Russia said that the dominant but feeble dollar could be taken over by the Chinese yuan, a more stable currency, according to Russia. The two countries have remained economically very close, and over the years, reports have noted that China is indeed trying to internationalize its currency with Russia's support. In 2017, a Carnegie report stated Beijing aims to act as a competitor to the US on the global financial stage. Still, the report said it was debatable if China wanted to shatter the dollar's role as the world's major reserve currency, as this could create major problems for China and might explode in its face. Still, that was then. A lot of things have happened in the last few years. It's as if the world has been shaken like a snow globe, but nothing was glued down. Yet again, Russia's talking about the Chinese yuan becoming the world's reserve currency. You might have noticed that Chinese President Xi Jinping just went to Moscow in the midst of the Ukraine war. China has told the world that it wants no part in the war, but there's more to global relations than sending weapons to countries. Yet again, the two countries made some economic agreements, 14 in all this time, which some critics have called a challenge to the US-led global order. China said in a press release that this meeting was not in any way a confrontation directed against third countries. Nonetheless, in a joint statement, they called for an acceleration of the process of establishing a multipolar world order. If you were the USA, it'd be hard not to see this as confrontational, given the US doesn't really want to relinquish its status as the sole superpower in what has been for years a unipolar world order. The two leaders talked about global stability and their belief that U.S. hegemony, geopolitically and economically, isn't good for stability. As for the matter of currencies, Putin said, "We are in favor of using the Chinese yuan for settlements between Russia and the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. I'm confident that these forms of settlement in yuan will develop between Russian partners and their counterparts in third countries." On top of this, BRICS, which is an economic group comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, will meet later this year in South Africa to discuss alternative global reserve assets, meaning not the dollar. Russia already has deals with India and China involving energy, and they don't want to use the dollar. They want to use the rupee and the yuan. Brazil just increased trade with China, and on a visit to China, the Brazilian president called for less reliance on the US dollar. Is this starting to sound like a familiar tune? Well, there's more. Saudi Arabia is set to build a $10 billion oil refinery in China, and yet again, the dollar is being threatened by this deal as the yuan will take its place with respect to the oil that'll be sold. France and China have also made a deal involving natural gas, which will be settled in yuan. A newspaper reported, "The trade involving 65,000 tons of LNG imported from the United Arab Emirates marks a major step in Beijing's attempts to undermine the US dollar as universal petrodollar for gas and oil trade." China has discussed multi-currency pricing and a diversified ecology. Also, central banks have been buying gold reserves. The demand for gold increased a massive 18% in 2022. The main reason that's been happening is because of the uncertainty of the dollar. In the first quarter of 2023, data suggests that this gold buying trend is taking off even more. Many economies are dumping their dollars and buying yuan or gold. These include China, Russia, France, Japan, and the UK. So-called de-dollarization is real. But let's not forget that about 90% of the trade in the world happens in dollars. Right now, only 2.8% of the world's exchange reserves are in yuan. As you know, 59% are in USD and around 20% in euros. The Japanese yen makes up 5.3% and the British pound 4.6%. As we started researching the show, major media companies reported this. For the first time ever, the yuan has eclipsed the US dollar as the most used currency for Chinese cross-border transactions. That's news, but when it comes to global currency transactions, the yuan only makes up 4.5%. The general consensus is that at the very least, the yuan is making inroads in its attack on the dollar. Still, those screaming the end of the dollar is nigh might be a little hysterical. As another analyst explained, the dollar to the world economy is what English is to international language. It'll be hard to replace. Things can change, but they'll change slowly. The problem for the US is they are changing slowly. Argentina has just made a deal with China to pay in yuan for its Chinese imports. The same story said nations in Southeast Asia are also pushing for de-dollarization, with Asian countries stating what other regions have been saying, that they are tired of the US's weaponization of its currency, which is causing countries to suffer. Bloomberg explained, the weaponization of the world's reserve currency, as through sanctions on those deemed bad actors such as Russia for its war in Ukraine, has pushed even the typically diplomatic Southeast Asians to warn the US of the consequences. The former foreign minister of Singapore just said the US dollar is a hex on all of us. Hex means curse, if you didn't know. He said what many people have been saying. If you start throwing your weight around and exploiting the dollar's seemingly omnipotence, replacements will naturally come. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs talked about the perils of the U.S. hegemony in 2023, saying the U.S. character is defined by violence and expansion. It calls taking advantage of the dollar seigniorage. On its website, the ministry wrote, it costs only about 17 cents to produce a $100 bill, but other countries have to pony up $100 of actual goods in order to obtain one. The hegemony of the U.S. dollar is the main source of instability and uncertainty in the world economy. Here's a word-for-word example of the abuse according to China. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the United States abused its global financial hegemony and injected trillions of dollars into the global market, leaving other countries, especially emerging economies, to pay the price. In 2022, the Fed ended its ultra-easy monetary policy and turned to aggressive interest rate hikes, causing turmoil in the international financial market and substantial depreciation of other currencies. You might be thinking, well, China would say that. And indeed, this show is about how China might want to collapse the dollar. Saying such things can indeed hurt the US and its dollar. But China isn't the only country saying this. Other nations would agree with China when it talks about the US hegemonic, domineering, and bullying practices. Is this how China brings in a new era of multipolarity? One newspaper said China had just lobbed a diplomatic grenade at the US. Americans are worried, according to a Pew Research poll that revealed 67% of people see China as a major threat to U.S. power, and 66% said China's power and influence are getting stronger. 62% said they're worried about China's cozy relationship with Russia. Not everyone is worried, though. One person wrote on Twitter, "Goodbye dollar hegemony. Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand now have digital payment systems that enable settlements in local currencies. How long before this is replicated worldwide?" Good question, and while it's sensational, there is some truth to it. China has talked about setting up an Asian monetary fund to replace the IMF and the dollar. The Malaysian Prime Minister said in April 2023, there's no reason for Malaysia to continue depending on the dollar. India and Malaysia have already agreed to do business in the rupee. These Asian nations are at the center of global growth too. The IMF said this year it's expected that Asia will likely contribute more than 70% to global growth. The American Institute for Economic Research did admit that the U.S.'s economic warfare and error-fraught monetary policy regimes have been driving countries away. Still, given the numbers about global trading we've shown you today, it is impossible that the dollar will stop being used globally. Such a switch could never be done overnight, but that doesn't mean hyperinflation isn't on the way. The dollar is a proven and trusted currency, even if it's taken a bit of a hit. Has the balance of power been upset? Yes, a little. Could it get more unbalanced? For absolute sure. Will unipolar become bipolar? There's a chance, but not anytime soon. Has the US bitten off its nose to spite its face? Possibly. An economist in the Financial Times said the dollar's injuries are self-inflicted. He gave a number of reasons, stating these include financial sanctions against its rivals, restrictions to inward investment in many national security-sensitive sectors and firms, and even secondary sanctions against friends who violate the primary ones. More nations than we've discussed have expressed they want less reliance on the dollar in the face of the US creating challenging times for them, especially in the Middle East and South America. This is pretty shocking on the whole, and as one analyst told Bloomberg, it's been happening at a stunning pace. But as we keep saying, this should not collapse the dollar anytime soon. It's notable, but countries still rely on the dollar, and importantly, they fear the lack of transparency in China to want to rely on the yuan wholly. Undemocratic countries are probably not the best places to completely trust with your economy. The US also doesn't have strict capital controls, meaning people can easily access their funds, while China does have very strict capital controls. Authoritarian regimes are sometimes known for being arbitrary in what they decide is best, which scares nations. No one wants their money to suddenly become locked up. If we think of it this way, the euro is a bigger threat to the dollar than the yuan. Then again, it's the yuan making all the headway. The question is it good enough just repeating that the dollar is still king? And citing economic statistics as all-around walls start to slowly crumble and your almost century-old foundations begin to heave and creak like the deck of a pirate ship in the first throes of a storm. Some people believe the US better step up its game if it intends to keep wearing the heavy crown that gives it superpower status. Many say changes are afoot, and you'd be in denial to say there aren't. Those in the middle say the US needs to rethink its position as a superpower and find a way through this. As the great Niccolò Machiavelli said in his book The Prince, you can't sit back when you're on the top because someone's always trying to take your crown. He warned it's a common fault of men to not reckon on storms in fair weather. The US should heed that, many people are saying. All empires fall, all great powers decline. Your grip loosens and your influence often fades when you're too busy looking inwards or fighting amongst yourselves to see the wood through the trees. The New York Times in 2022 talked about how the US is now so polarized. People have less trust in the media and democracy than ever before. It cited a Pew Research poll that said just 17% of Americans nowadays believe U.S. democracy is not a good example for other countries to follow. But China, that's an autocracy, and you won't find many Americans who want to live under one of those. A Harvard scholar said in that article, one of the side effects of losing democracy is losing control over the markets. I think it's an incredibly dangerous moment. I think we absolutely could lose democracy. As a French expert on foreign policy said in 2023, this is very unlike the America of the past. It looks like this will be a century of disorder, and that's pretty scary. In 2022, an article in The Conversation discusses the myth of the American hyperpower, meaning, as we just said, the US might be intoxicated with its own strength as a shipwrecking storm blows in on the horizon. Even so, the dollar isn't going anywhere as the reserve currency, not yet and not for a while, but when you have countries all over the world starting to consider using other currencies, the US might need to take note. The historian Niall Ferguson thinks that, saying in an interview that we should not underestimate how quickly the structure of the international financial system would change if the US was no longer the credible #1 global superpower. He then said a world with China as the #1 power was far from agreeable, saying the old totalitarian devil could pop its head up when it feels like it needs to wield power. He also mentioned that we are in a Cold War and China needs to be contained, possibly by cutting it off technologically. Then again, the US's foreign policy over the decades and troubles at home had plenty of critics who usually said the US needed to change how it leads as a superpower. They say multipolarity is certain, so good diplomacy is the only thing that would prevent us from destroying ourselves. From what we can see, some people are exaggerating about the speed and certainty of the dollar's value falling, but others are in denial about any possible fall. The truth is, this is a crossroads moment in history. There might not be an alternative to the dollar right now, but one might come, especially if the US gives countries reasons to not trust its currency. As the Roman statesman and philosopher Seneca once said, there is no favorable wind for the sailor who does not know where to go. Many are saying the US needs to get its ship back on track, or bigger ships will blow it out of the water. A man is standing in the train station after just being told he's not allowed to board a high-speed train. Standing opposite him is a woman with a gadget in her hand and something on the screen blinking red. She points to an image and he thinks, "You have got to be kidding me," as he stares at a cute Shih Tzu dog over which there's a large red X. The guy almost falls over when he sees a picture of himself wearing pajamas in public. Again, it's marked with an X. Can you guess what he's done wrong? We doubt you can because it's not the kind of thing that would naturally spring to mind. certainly not in the Western world. We'll explain this man's transgression soon, but for now, let's just say he's been a bad boy, and his citizen score is less than admirable. In China, Big Brother is always watching. If you want to rank your citizens, you have to keep an eye on them constantly. So first of all, let's see how China does that and compare it with the West. The study we found revealed that for China's 1.4 billion plus population, there were around 200 million CCTV cameras. That works out to just over 14 CCTV cameras for every 100 people. We should add that there are lots of similar studies about China's surveillance, and they all report unique data. Another study says China has 540 million CCTV cameras, and that's quite a difference. From what we can see, the 200 million number is probably too low. If the 540 million figure is correct, that would be about 38 cameras for every 100 people. All the studies we found agree that China has the most surveilled cities on the planet, with the UK and the US also appearing in the top 10 lists of CCTV surveillance. Some studies suggest the US has anywhere from 47 to 70 million CCTV cameras, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics said the number's closer to 85 million for the 336 plus million people in the US. That would work out to be about 25 cameras for every 100 people. The UK is also very high, with about 7 million CCTV cameras for its 67 plus million people. That's close to 10 cameras for every 100 people. Although other sources say this number is way too low, while researchers can't seem to agree, many say in China, the US, and the UK, there is one camera for every 3 or 4 people. But in a world where it seems like there's a camera for every few people, isn't it fair to ask, who's watching the watchers? Well, we got a solution, and it comes from the sponsor of today's video, Private Internet Access, the world's most transparent VPN provider. Boasting over 30 million downloads, PIA truly stands for user privacy. It hides your IP address and keeps your digital life cloaked, shielding it from prying eyes, whether that's your ISP, network admins, or even the government. Using the internet without PIA is like showering in a room with no door. Everyone can hear your bad singing skills. PIA has also proven its no logs policy in court battles and with an external audit from none other than Deloitte, one of the biggest and most trusted accounting firms in the world. But PIA isn't just about protection, it's also about giving you freedom. Whether you're in Shanghai, London, or New York, it makes all major streaming services accessible, with its servers located in 84 countries and in every US state. Also, PIA VPN is one of the few VPNs that supports P2P file sharing, giving you even more access to content. PIA runs seamlessly across platforms: Windows, Mac OS, Android, Linux, iOS, and many others. With a single subscription, you can protect an unlimited number of devices simultaneously. But hold on, it gets even better. We have a special offer for our viewers. Just go to piavpn.com/geopolitico and get an 83% discount on private internet access. And if that didn't convince you yet, subscribing to private internet access is completely risk-free. They have a 30-day money-back guarantee, and if you ever need help, their 24/7 customer support is ready and waiting. So go try private internet access right now. After all, your privacy deserves no less. But as we were saying, while researchers can't seem to agree, many say in China, the US, and the UK, there is one camera for every 3 or 4 people. The saying that comes to mind is, it's what you do with it that counts. In the US, CCTV cameras are often used for policing and security, but not for invasive surveillance. In China, that's the standard. Chinese cameras are often hooked up to a high-tech surveillance system. What is also important is online surveillance, something we can get a good idea about from how many official data requests there are from law enforcement to tech companies. We know the numbers in the West, but unfortunately, China doesn't share such data. When it comes to data reports from Google last year, the US was easily the highest in the world outside of China, at over 72,000 in the first half of 2022. India, 32,000 plus, was next, followed by Germany at over 25,000, Brazil over 11,000, and the UK over 9,000. Given the small populations of Germany and the UK, these numbers are relatively high. Still, it's probably nothing compared to how many data requests the Chinese government makes from China's answer to Google, Baidu. Big tech firms in China have no choice but to share data with the government. Some of those big companies are Alibaba, Baidu, ByteDance, and Tencent. Under the Chinese cybersecurity law introduced in 2016, the Chinese government made it legal to conduct checks on any tech company's data anytime it wanted, all in the name of national security. To give you an example of how strict the government is, China's Cyber Administration ordered ByteDance to close a popular social media platform not long ago because it said some of the jokes and conversations amounted to improper public opinion. Not hate speech, just speech the government didn't like. Can you imagine Twitter being shut down for allowing improper public opinion? Actually, there's a story here, but we'll return to this controversial matter at the end. Article 28 of the Chinese cybersecurity law states, network operators shall provide technical support and assistance to public security organs and national security organs that are safeguarding national security and investigating criminal activities in accordance with the law. It basically means when we come a-knockin', you have to open the door. When someone says something the government finds distasteful, the companies, by law, have to give up that person if there is a request. Big Brother is watching you in China more than other countries, which is why China has been described as a giant panopticon. The panopticon was a prison concept created by Jeremy Bentham, the British philosopher behind utilitarianism. If Bentham could see the world in action today, he'd look at China and probably think, yep, that's the way to do it. His theory was that if people understand they're being watched all the time, they'll be motivated to do the right thing. Chinese people know that they're being watched. It's taken for granted, so the theory goes that because they assume they're being watched, they will police themselves. In countries such as the US and UK, people kind of assume they have some privacy, not so much in China. China's Great Firewall blocks various internet sites and ensures lots and lots of information isn't even searchable. There is constant government monitoring of what people look at and post online. There are all those CCTV cameras too, but there's also facial recognition technology. China is leading the way in this field. The US has developed some very advanced facial recognition tech too. Still, we'll show you later, Americans have been fighting back in regard to their faces being scanned. The Chinese government tells the Chinese people that facial recognition is beneficial to them. Some people agree, but this is controversial at the moment. A recent survey by a Beijing research institute revealed 74% of respondents said they'd rather have traditional ways of identifying people than tech scanning them everywhere they went. Even though 57% of people in the study said they were concerned about such tech, 60 to 70% agreed that it leads to less crime. That's because when a criminal is caught using facial recognition, the public often hears about the good news on TV. When a heroin dealer was arrested in the city of Zhangzhou not long ago, the news said the cops spotted the dealer with their new facial recognition glasses. They scanned the guy in the street, the facial recognition got to work, and the dealer was subsequently arrested. The deputy chief of police told the media, in the past it was all about instinct. If you miss something, you missed it. Chinese citizens might have heard that on TV and thought facial recognition is indeed for the public good, although some of them might not have thought about the implications you're going to hear about later. In another case, over 20 people were arrested at a beer festival in Qingdao. CCTV powered with AI was the reason they were caught. Their faces were in a database, and when the cameras picked them up, the cops were alerted. In Wuhu, cops arrested a guy who was on a murder charge after CCTV saw him buying some dinner from a small food stand. In a study on facial recognition, China was said to be the leader of the world when it comes to countries currently employing it. Russia was second, the United Arab Emirates was third, next in order were Japan, India, China, Brazil, Australia, France, Hungary, Malaysia, the UK, Argentina, the US, and then Mexico. China was easily at the top. That's partly because facial recognition is being used to shame people, not just arrest them. In Suzhou, if people left their home in their pajamas, facial recognition picked them up, and then they appeared on the city's WeChat account. This wasn't against the law, but it was supposed to make them think twice about leaving the house not properly dressed. The program was supposed to expose uncivilized behaviors and improve citizens' quality, but the city later admitted that it went too far and apologized. They wrote, "We wanted to put an end to uncivilized behavior, but of course we should protect residents' privacy." A park in one city used the technology to stop people from stealing toilet paper. Some schools have also tried that out. It was employed to spot kids who weren't paying attention in class. So yes, facial recognition tech is now everywhere in China. But today we're talking about social credit, a person's citizen score. Facial recognition is helping with this. As we just told you, sometimes the people in the wrong appear online or have their picture printed somewhere. There are many reports of walls of shame harkening back to the days of Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution. In 2018, it was reported that in Anhui there were giant billboards featuring the names and faces of people who hadn't paid their debts. According to South China Morning Post, there were 10.5 million people who were publicly listed in China for being in debt. To address the problem of debt, the People's Court of Hejiang County in southwest China's Sichuan province showed moviegoers trailers in the theater featuring debtors. Can you imagine that? Sitting down with some popcorn to watch Fast and the Furious 25, and you star in the trailers. This is what social credit scores are sometimes about, shaming people so they'll do the right thing. It really is the digital panopticon. It works too. Or at least it has worked in some of the stories we read while doing research for the show. At a busy intersection in the city of Shenyang, jaywalkers and fast drivers used to cause chaos, so the city used CCTV cameras with facial recognition cameras and installed a giant screen. Soon, lawbreakers' faces appeared on the screen with their names and other details. This was not just about fining people, it was about shaming them. Jaywalking rates soon decreased, but was all that spying a good thing? Some people thought so, especially when they heard bicycle thefts also decreased in some cities. Ask a Brit about bicycle theft. In the UK, they'll say, if it's not nailed down, someone will take it. But would they want China's kind of surveillance? We'll come back to that at the end. This all still sounds very dystopian, like something from an episode of Black Mirror. It sounds like a life where you might constantly be trying to do good things to accrue more points for more freedom and benefits. It also sounds like George Orwell's book 1984, which is where we get the Big Brother concept from. That's how the Western press has generally painted China's social credit system. But the Western press has sometimes been known for spreading anti-Chinese propaganda. The Diplomat in 2023 said, anti-China rhetoric is off the charts in the Western media, calling it hysteria and bias. It is true, on any given day you can find a certain hysteria regarding China and how awful it is. Sometimes the criticism is definitely warranted, but the many social credit system articles in the media were and are in fact wildly exaggerated. To give you an example, in 2018, Vice President Mike Pence said, by 2020, China's rulers aim to implement an Orwellian system premised on controlling virtually every facet of human life, the so-called social credit score. In the words of that program's official blueprint, it will allow the trustworthy to roam everywhere under heaven while making it hard for the discredited to take a single step. While China's surveillance is shocking, nothing like the dystopian reality many viewers have discussed is true. No one in China has ever been barred from the cinema at 20 for kicking a dog in high school. There's never been a national database full of people's scores. People are not watched all day, all night, so they'll always do the right thing. You won't get penalized because you decided to read books by George Orwell. The social credit system was never about controlling every facet of human life. The system was set up in various Chinese cities, that much is true, but it was mostly about getting people to pay their debts or about folks being a public nuisance and doing things like stealing bicycles. What the Western press usually left out was that the cities testing it often asked people to volunteer for the scheme. In fact, in many places, the system was there to expose public officials who'd been corrupt. In other cases, you could receive a bad score for not paying your debts, and while you might appear on a national database, this wasn't much different from the credit scores you get in most Western nations. Rather than this being something the Chinese people were worried about all the time, most folks never gave it a second thought if indeed they knew such a system existed in their city. It was an experiment in most places, often only involving businesses. For instance, if a business kept ripping people off or selling dodgy equipment, it might appear on a list. Some people, of course, appreciated this. That's not what we heard, though. A spokesperson for the U.S. National Broadband Task Force for the FCC under Obama said that this would be the end of freedom in China, explaining China would not only become a totalitarian police state that monitors its people, but one that completely evades users' privacy. He added all forms of activity and interactions, online or otherwise, will be rated, available to view, and stored as data. Such words sparked outrage and fear. There were subsequent discussions in the US with people saying just because you play many hours of video games doesn't mean you're idle, and just because you don't have kids doesn't mean you're irresponsible. Some people said there's nothing wrong with having a beer after a hard day's graft. Not all keep fit fanatics are good people, said others. For God's sake, Ted Bundy worked on a hotline for vulnerable women after working out in the gym. But none of these conversations were relevant to anything. China wasn't trying to score people's lives to put them in the good or bad camp. As the fear in the West was spreading like the Black Death, Chinese people might have read Western media and thought, what in Confucius's name are they talking about over there? Sure, Chinese people, or most Chinese people, know they live with a lot of surveillance. Some of them have protested against it in the street, just as surveillance technology was trying to track their masked faces. When some people protested against China's pandemic policies, facial recognition recognized them, and soon the cops were at their door. Nonetheless, Chinese people would probably still look at you with a funny expression on their face if you asked them what their entire life social credit score was, or if you told them to go easy on the beer lest they get denied entrance to the panda enclosure at the local zoo. The main point of the system in most places where it was trialed was to cut down on corruption and business fraud rather than prevent children from seeing pandas at the zoo because their father played League of Legends for 8 hours straight. People know they're surveilled, make no mistake, but the 1984 reality that was portrayed in some parts of the Western media was unknown to many Chinese citizens. A senior research fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center in Beijing explained to Wired, the system as it exists today is more of a patchwork of regional pilots and experimental projects with few indications about what could be implemented at a national scale. I really think you would find a much larger percentage of Americans are aware of Chinese social credit than you would find Chinese people are aware of Chinese social credit. In many places, the schemes were more like loyalty reward programs. In other cities, if people had a good credit rating relating to their finances, they might later be trusted to defer paying some medical expenses. They were never about tracking or recording someone's entire life. As of 2022, it's thought there were 62 such systems in towns and cities throughout China. In many cases, people chose to take part because they wanted the rewards. People would gain points and get a free health checkup or a discount on a bike hire, or they could get fast-tracked for a visa application. In the experiment so far, in some cities at least, only between 1.5% and 15% of residents agreed to take part. They were also told their score only worked in that city, since other cities often use different systems. There have been blacklists and red lists for businesses, with the businesses on the red lists being the ones that haven't breached any industry regulations. These regulations were already there in Chinese law, but now there was a website where people could find businesses that had violated the regulations and ones that hadn't. So the point system was there to help people find a business they could trust. In other cases, you could end up on the list if you didn't pay a fine. This does indeed sound a bit dystopian, but it's still not quite Black Mirror-esque. If people were on a court's blacklist, they might not have been able to buy a high-speed train ticket. There are reports of parents not paying their debts, ending up on a blacklist, and their children being denied entrance to a school or a university. There was the case in which a guy's children were not allowed to enter a certain school because of his debts. Then he paid them and the kids were good to go. In another case that will resonate with Americans, especially New Yorkers, Beijing introduced a point system for its rapid transit system. You could lose points for being a nuisance on the train, such as eating, blasting music, drunkenness, smoking electronic cigarettes, acting threatening, or anything along those lines. Breaking the law was breaking the law, but smaller acts of misbehavior meant bad social credit. In the city of Guangzhou, the local government said you could appear on a blacklist system if you didn't pay your bills, insurance, taxes, or utility fees. The scheme also made it so that if young people cheated on their exams, they could end up in the database. A local government announcement explained, "The public credit information of natural persons cannot be seen by everyone and can be queried at will, but can be disclosed through inquiries and the sharing of government affairs and is generally not publicized." In a case we mentioned at the start, one city thought about a law concerning pets. That's because the city had problems with people abandoning their dogs and cats when they became bored with them. So, in the proposal, a man said, let's dock them points for doing that. It didn't mean they'd go to jail, but they might find out something became unavailable to them. Reports state that the Chinese government has prevented over 20 million people from buying plane tickets because they're on a blacklist for the things we've described. To most Westerners, this might sound nightmarish, and for a good reason, but the social credit system still wasn't as bad as reported. That doesn't mean it's not oppressive, though. The surveillance in China to most Americans does seem horrific, given that Americans value their privacy and independence arguably more than other countries' citizens. The US came second after Israel in a World Population Review study of the most individualistic countries. In another study, the US came in first, followed by Australia and the UK. China ranked near the bottom. Americans might not like it if the US government awarded people points for eating healthy so as to cut down on obesity, one of the US's most costly and deadly issues. For most Americans, that's way too much government in their lives. The UK government has actually mulled over a privacy-busting app to fight the obesity crisis. This was indeed a kind of social credit scheme. People would be awarded points for eating the right foods. Remember, people these days pay for things using their phones, so it's easy to track what they eat. In 2021, the gov.uk website wrote, "Pilot scheme will motivate people to make healthy changes to their lifestyle." It added the government is committed to helping people lead healthier, happier lives by making it easier for people to make healthy choices. You can't argue that people need to eat better to live better lives, on average anyway. Still, the age-old question arises, how much government do people need in their lives? Some people argue that Britain, remember, a country where you're almost always on CCTV, could be the next country to initiate some kind of social credit system. In 2021, the Spectator newspaper wrote, "We need to act now to block Britain's social credit system." This was mostly about the pandemic and vaccine passports, but the article added, The government is planning to introduce a health app in January which will monitor our shopping, our exercise levels, our intake of fruit and vegetables, and reward us with virtue points which we can exchange for discounts, free tickets, and other goodies. Virtue points, said the article, sounds a lot like China. China is leading the way in surveillance, but are other countries trying to catch up? The UK just introduced a highly controversial police act that'll make it harder to protest. There are recent reports of people being arrested for what Orwell would have called a thought crime. Police arrested people for embracing their freedom of expression online. While these instances might have offended someone, they only involved citizens airing opinions. The cops called these non-crime hate incidents. Critics pointed out that this was quite an Orwellian expression. People were contacted and put on the blacklist because of the possibility of committing a crime in the future. Over in the US, the Twitter files showed the government agencies were able to tell Twitter executives to shadow ban or block stories they thought were dangerous misinformation. Turned out to be true, and in fact, never even looked like misinformation to a discerning eye. This was very much in-your-face censorship, said many people. It was the government shaping narratives, they said. It turned out people were being watched for what they said and put on blacklists even if they had a very valid opinion. This is absolutely normal in China, but not in America. Some people or groups in the West worry about being blocked from using financial transaction systems. A free speech advocate writing in The Hill said, "This could create a system in which individuals who do not hold certain political views could be blocked from polite society and left unable to make a living." If people fear not being able to get money, will they stay in line and say the right thing? This is why some people worry about such things as the digital dollar, similar to China's digital yuan. Many Westerners fear all currency going digital in case they're frozen out of their money. 60% of transactions in China are already cashless, but other countries, including the US, are also much more cashless these days. What if PayPal locked you out, or a government threatened GoFundMe for no rational reason, and that prevented you from getting much-needed funds? This is one of the reasons the American Civil Liberties Union said in 2019, "Say no to the cashless future and to cashless stores." A writer for CNBC called it a huge threat to our freedom because it'll permit governments to exercise incredibly powerful control over all human behavior. Statistics show that the Asia-Pacific region leads for the number of cashless transactions, followed by Europe and then North America. In terms of what people want, 77% of South Koreans said in a survey they prefer cashless. Sweden was next at 74%, then came Russia, 72%, UK 70%, France at 67%, China at 67%, Spain at 61%, Japan at 60%, and the US at 58%. This was a big study featuring 676,000 people. In a Privacy HQ poll, 47% of Americans were actually for some kind of social credit system. 14% were neutral, 39% were against it. Gen Z was the most up for it. The older people were the least in favor, with the middle-aged in the middle. Uber and Airbnb already have such a system. Social media sites also sometimes have a strike system. So in some ways, we already have a social credit system. Still, in that poll, lots of people said they feared the loss of freedom to speak, too much government control and bias in the system. People worry about living in a world where they're watched and recorded at all times, where their faces are analyzed by AI, perhaps while protesting about controversial government measures. You need top-class facial recognition to do this. Studies show in 2008, China wasn't really selling its surveillance tech anywhere in the world. Now, over 80 nations have imported Chinese surveillance technology. Some cities in the US, including San Francisco, have banned the use of facial recognition by police. In the state of Illinois, the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act prevents cops from scanning faces. Many people feel this way in the US. Some companies, such as Microsoft and Amazon, scaled back development after a public outcry. Many Americans are not too keen on going down the Chinese route of mass surveillance. Facial recognition and social credit scores might be coming, never mind what happens, if it can be shown it worked well at some point or another, especially where violent crime is concerned. Maybe some people will still say it's going too far and embrace what Confucius once said, "Cultivate the root, the leaves and branches will take care of themselves." Do we really need a panopticon? China's social credit system may not have been as bad as we were told, but it did point to a new reality in which people are watched all the time that they're out in public. Now go ahead and check out this video, or maybe this one instead.